The storm clouds over Millbrook Harbor were unleashing their fury when single father Ryan Torres saw a woman in a wedding dress running through the rain, clutching her torn gown and sobbing as three men in expensive suits chased after her through the empty parking lot. What Ryan didn't know as he stepped out of his beat-up Honda to help this desperate stranger was that he was about to protect someone from losing a $500 million inheritance, and that this moment would change both their lives forever. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Ryan Torres had seen plenty of storms during his 31 years in Millbrook Harbor, but the October tempest battering the coastal town felt different, angrier, more relentless. The rain hammered against his windshield as he drove home from his second job at Henderson's Marina, where he spent evenings cleaning boats after his day shift at the hardware store. His 7-year-old daughter Lily was waiting at Mrs. Patterson's house next door, probably doing homework at the kitchen table while stealing glances at the clock, wondering when Daddy would finally come home. Ryan's life had become a carefully orchestrated dance of survival since his wife Emma had died in a car accident 2 years ago. Every minute was accounted for, every dollar stretched to its absolute limit. The small apartment they rented on Seabird Street wasn't much. Thin walls, creaky floors, and a heater that worked when it felt like it, but it was home. More importantly, it was all he could afford, while still managing to put food on the table and keep Lily in the decent elementary school across town. As he turned into the nearly empty parking lot of Ocean View Plaza, planning to grab a few groceries from the discount market that stayed open late, Ryan noticed something that made him slow his Honda to a crawl. Through the sheets of rain, illuminated by the harsh fluorescent lights of the shopping center, he could see what looked like a person in white stumbling between the parked cars. Ryan squinted through his rain-streaked windshield, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. The figure was definitely a woman, and she was wearing what appeared to be a wedding dress, though it was now torn and muddy, dragging behind her as she ran. Her dark hair was plastered to her face, and even from a distance Ryan could see that she was crying. But what made Ryan's protective instincts kick into high gear wasn't just the sight of a woman in distress. It was the three men in dark suits who were pursuing her, their movements coordinated and determined. They weren't running frantically like someone trying to help. They were hunting. Ryan had served 4 years in the Coast Guard before Emma's pregnancy brought him back to civilian life, and his training had taught him to recognize predatory behavior. These men weren't good Samaritans concerned about a distressed bride. They were closing in on their target with the precision of people who had done this before. Without hesitation, Ryan pulled his Honda directly into the path between the woman and her pursuers, threw the car into park, and stepped out into the driving rain. The October wind immediately soaked through his work jacket, but he barely noticed. His attention was focused entirely on the woman who had stumbled to a stop near his car, her chest heaving as she tried to catch her breath. "Ma'am, are you okay?" Ryan called out, having to raise his voice over the howling wind. "Do you need help?" The woman looked up at him with the most terrified eyes Ryan had ever seen. She couldn't have been more than 25, with delicate features that spoke of privilege and careful upbringing, but right now she looked like a cornered animal. Her wedding dress, which had probably cost more than Ryan made in 6 months, was ruined, torn at the shoulder, stained with mud, and clinging to her small frame like a soggy shroud. "Please," she gasped, reaching toward him with hands that shook from more than just the cold. "Please don't let them take me back. I can't. I won't." That was when the three men reached them. "Excuse me, sir," said the tallest of the group, a man with silver hair and a voice that carried the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "This is a private family matter. The young lady is having a bit of a wedding day crisis, as you can imagine. We're here to help her get back to her ceremony." Ryan looked from the man to the woman, whose terror had somehow intensified at his words. She was shaking her head frantically, backing toward Ryan's car as if it could provide some kind of protection. "That's not what this looks like to me," Ryan said calmly, positioning himself between the woman and the three men. His Coast Guard training had taught him to de-escalate situations, but it had also taught him to trust his instincts. And every instinct he had was screaming that something was very wrong here. The silver-haired man's expression hardened. "Sir, I appreciate your concern, but this really isn't your business. Miss Whitmore is expected at St. Catherine's Cathedral, and her family is quite worried about her." "Whitmore?" Ryan glanced back at the woman, who flinched at the name as if it were a curse word. "That's not my name," she whispered, but only loud enough for Ryan to hear. "Not anymore. Please, I'm begging you, don't let them take me." Ryan had faced down drug smugglers and Coast Guard cutters, and had broken up bar fights that would have sent smaller men to the hospital, but something about this young woman's desperate plea cut right through all his defenses. He saw his own daughter in her terror, the vulnerability, the need for someone to stand between her and the things that wanted to hurt her. "Look, gentlemen," Ryan said, keeping his voice steady and reasonable, "the lady says she doesn't want to go with you. Maybe you should give her some space to think things through." The second man, younger with cold eyes and an expensive watch that caught the light, stepped forward. "And maybe you should mind your own business before this becomes a problem for you." That was the wrong thing to say to Ryan Torres. "Actually," Ryan replied, his voice taking on the edge that had once made Coast Guard recruits stand at attention, "I think it already is my problem." "Ma'am," he said, turning slightly toward the woman while keeping the three men in his peripheral vision, "would you like me to call the police?" The woman's eyes widened with something that looked like hope mixed with fresh terror. "Yes," she breathed. "Please, yes." Ryan pulled out his phone, but before he could dial, the silver-haired man held up a hand. "That won't be necessary," he said, his voice now carrying a barely concealed threat. "Miss Whitmore, your grandfather is waiting. The ceremony is in 2 hours, and there are 200 guests expecting to see you married to Jeremy Blackstone. Don't make this more difficult than it needs to be." "I said that's not my name," the woman suddenly shouted, her voice cracking with emotion, "and I'm not marrying Jeremy. I don't care how much money is involved, I won't do it." Money. Ryan filed that detail away, beginning to understand that this wasn't just about a reluctant bride. This was about something much bigger and much more dangerous. The rain continued to pour down around them, turning the parking lot into a battlefield where a young woman's future hung in the balance. Ryan looked at her tear-streaked face, saw the desperation and determination warring in her expression, and made a decision that would change everything. "The lady said no," Ryan announced firmly, "so I suggest you gentlemen get back in your car and leave her alone." The third man, who had been silent until now, pulled out his phone. "Mr. Ashford isn't going to like this," he muttered. "Mr. Ashford can deal with it," Ryan replied, "but right now you're dealing with me." As the three men reluctantly retreated to their black sedan, casting threatening glances over their shoulders, Ryan had no idea that he had just stepped between a terrified heiress and the $500 million fortune that men had killed for. He only knew that a woman needed help, and helping people in trouble was what decent human beings did. What happened next would prove that sometimes the most extraordinary stories begin with the simplest acts of human kindness. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. To understand why Ryan Torres didn't hesitate to step between a terrified woman and 3 dangerous men in expensive suits, you need to know the story of how a Coast Guard hero became a single father, barely keeping his head above water in the small coastal town of Millbrook Harbor. 2 years and 4 months ago, Ryan Torres had been a different man entirely. He'd been Staff Sergeant Ryan Torres of the U.S. Coast Guard, decorated rescue swimmer with 43 successful saves to his credit, married to his high school sweetheart Emma, and father to 5-year-old Lily, who thought her daddy could walk on water. They'd lived in a modest but comfortable house on Maple Ridge Drive, with a white picket fence that Emma had insisted on painting herself, and a garden where she grew tomatoes that somehow always tasted better than store-bought. White Pool. Ryan's Coast Guard station was just 20 minutes from home, close enough that he could make it to Lily's school plays and soccer games, close enough that Emma never had to feel like a single parent, despite his demanding job. Life wasn't perfect. Military families never had it easy, but it was good. It was stable. It was everything Ryan had dreamed of when he'd asked Emma to marry him on the beach where they'd had their first date. Then came March 15th, a date that would forever divide Ryan's life into before and after. Emma had been driving home from her part-time job at the Millbrook Harbor Public Library, the same route she'd taken hundreds of times before. Lily was safely at after-school care, waiting for Mommy to pick her up at 5:30 like always. The weather was clear, traffic was light, and Emma was probably thinking about what to make for dinner, or whether Lily needed new shoes for her growing feet. She never saw the drunk driver who ran the red light at Ocean View and Harbor Street. The 18-year-old college student who killed Ryan's wife had been celebrating his friend's birthday at 3 different bars before getting behind the wheel of his father's BMW. He walked away from the accident with a broken wrist and a 5-year prison sentence that would be reduced to 3 years for good behavior. Emma Torres died instantly, according to the paramedics who tried desperately to save her life in the twisted wreckage of her Honda Accord. Ryan had been in the middle of a training exercise when his commanding officer pulled him aside with the news that would shatter his world. He remembered collapsing to his knees on the Coast Guard station's polished floor, remembered the sound that came out of his throat. Not quite a scream, not quite a sob, but something raw, an animal that he'd never heard from himself before. But even in his devastation, Ryan's first thought had been for Lily. His little girl was still at after-school care, playing with blocks or coloring pictures, completely unaware that her world had just ended too. Someone had to pick her up. Someone had to tell her that mommy wasn't coming home. Someone had to figure out how to keep living when the person who made life worth living was gone. The funeral had been a blur of flag ceremonies and casseroles from neighbors, of Lily asking when mommy was coming back and Ryan trying to explain death to a 5-year-old while he could barely understand it himself. Emma's parents had offered to take Lily just until you get back on your feet, but Ryan had refused. He was Lily's father, and losing her mother didn't mean she should lose him too. That decision, made in the fog of grief and determination, had set Ryan on a path that led him to that rainy parking lot 2 years later. The Coast Guard had been understanding, offering extended leave and counseling services, but Ryan quickly realized that single parenthood and military life were incompatible in ways he'd never considered. Coast Guard rescue operations didn't pause for parent-teacher conferences. Emergency calls didn't care if your daughter had a fever and couldn't go to school. The job that had defined Ryan's identity for 8 years suddenly became impossible to perform at the level his conscience demanded. So Staff Sergeant Ryan Torres became Mr. Torres, trading his uniform for civilian clothes and his government housing for whatever he could afford on a hardware store clerk's salary in Millbrook Harbor. He'd chosen to stay in their hometown because it was where Emma was buried, where Lily had friends, where the familiar sights and sounds might provide some semblance of continuity in their shattered lives. The transition from military precision to civilian struggle had been brutal. Ryan's Coast Guard pension wouldn't start until he turned 65, and his savings had been wiped out by Emma's funeral expenses and the costs of relocating to civilian life. The house on Maple Ridge Drive had to be sold to pay off debts, forcing Ryan and Lily into a cramped 2-bedroom apartment on Seabird Street, where the walls were thin enough to hear their neighbor's television and the heat worked sporadically. Ryan's daily routine had become a masterclass in logistical survival. Up at 5:30 a.m. to make Lily's breakfast and pack her lunch, walk her to Millbrook Elementary by 7:45, catch the bus to Henderson Hardware, where he worked until 3 o'clock, pick up Lily from after-school care, help with homework while making dinner, bedtime stories and prayers, then off to his evening job at Henderson's Marina cleaning boats until 10 p.m. Mrs. Patterson, their elderly neighbor, watched Lily during those evening hours in exchange for Ryan shoveling her driveway in winter and maintaining her small garden in summer. The weekends were reserved for laundry, grocery shopping, and the precious time with Lily that made everything else worthwhile. They would walk along Millbrook Harbor's rocky shoreline, collecting shells and sea glass while Lily chattered about school and friends and the elaborate dreams that 7-year-olds weave effortlessly. Sometimes she would ask about mommy, and Ryan would tell her stories about Emma's laugh or the way she used to sing while cooking dinner, keeping his wife's memory alive while trying not to break down in front of his daughter. Money was always tight, stretched between rent, utilities, groceries, and the 1,000 small expenses that came with raising a child. Ryan's Coast Guard training had taught him to live efficiently, to make do with less. But there were nights when he would sit at their small kitchen table after Lily was asleep, moving numbers around on paper, and wondering how other people made it look so easy. He'd sold Emma's engagement ring to pay for Lily's school supplies and winter clothes, a decision that had torn his heart out but was undeniably necessary. The wedding band stayed on his finger, though, not because he couldn't move on, but because it reminded him every day that he'd been loved completely by someone who believed he was capable of anything. The hardest part wasn't the physical exhaustion or the financial stress. It was the loneliness of carrying everything by himself, of making every decision without the partner who used to share the weight of parenthood. Emma had been his sounding board, his voice of reason, his source of encouragement when the world felt too heavy. Now Ryan made choices in isolation, second-guessing himself constantly, and praying that his best efforts would be enough for the little girl who depended on him for everything. Some nights, after Lily was tucked into bed with her worn stuffed rabbit and a story about princess adventures, Ryan would stand in their small living room and look at the framed photo of his family from happier times. Emma was holding baby Lily while Ryan stood behind them in his Coast Guard dress uniform, all three of them smiling at the camera with the unshakable confidence of people who believed their happiness was permanent. Those moments of memory could have broken him, could have sent him spiraling into the kind of despair that consumed men who'd lost everything. But then he would hear Lily's soft breathing from her bedroom, would remember her giggle when he made funny voices during story time, would think about her small hand slipping into his as they walked to school each morning, and Ryan would find the strength to keep going. Because that's what fathers did. They carried the weight so their children could fly. They sacrificed their own comfort so their kids could have stability. They found ways to be both mother and father, provider and protector, disciplinarian and playmate, even when the job felt impossible. Emma had always said that Ryan had a hero's heart, that he was drawn to helping people the way some people were drawn to music or mathematics. "You can't help yourself," she used to tease him after he'd spent his day off helping elderly Mrs. Rodriguez repair her fence or volunteering at the community center's soup kitchen. "You see someone who needs help, and you just have to be the one to provide it." Which is exactly why, on that stormy October evening when Ryan Torres saw a terrified woman in a wedding dress being pursued by three men who clearly meant her harm, he didn't hesitate. He didn't calculate the risks to himself or consider how getting involved might complicate his already difficult life. He just did what Emma had always known he would do. He stepped up to help someone who needed it, not knowing that this simple act of human decency was about to change everything for both of them. The black sedan with the three men idled at the edge of the parking lot, their headlights cutting through the rain like predatory eyes watching Ryan and the woman he'd chosen to protect. Ryan could feel their presence even as he focused on the trembling figure beside his Honda, her ruined wedding dress clinging to her small frame as she struggled to catch her breath. "What's your real name?" Ryan asked gently, keeping his voice low enough that the men in the sedan couldn't hear him over the storm. His Coast Guard training had taught him that establishing trust was the first step in any rescue operation, and everything about this situation screamed that this woman needed rescuing. She looked up at him with eyes that held a mixture of gratitude and terror. "Caroline," she whispered, "Caroline Ashford. And those men work for my grandfather." The name hit Ryan like a physical blow. Everyone in Millbrook Harbor knew the Ashford name. It was carved into half the buildings in town, stamped on the plaques at the hospital and the library, whispered in the kind of reverent tones reserved for local royalty. Old Theodore Ashford owned the largest shipping company on the East Coast, employed half the town directly or indirectly, and was rumored to be worth more money than some small countries. "Your grandfather sent men to drag you to your own wedding?" Ryan asked, though the pieces were already clicking into place in his mind. Rich families, arranged marriages, business deals disguised as love matches. He'd read enough history to know how these things worked. Caroline nodded miserably. "The man they want me to marry, Jeremy Blackstone. His family owns shipping routes that connect to grandfather's ports. If we marry, they'll control shipping from Boston to Miami. It's worth—" She paused, as if the number was too large to comprehend. "Grandfather says it's worth $500 million in the first year alone." $500 million. Ryan had to suppress a bitter laugh at the cosmic irony. Here he was, a man who counted every dollar twice before spending it, standing in the rain protecting a woman whose wedding was worth more money than he would see in 10 lifetimes. "And you don't want to marry him," Ryan said. It wasn't really a question. "Jeremy Blackstone is a monster," Carolyn said, her voice gaining strength as she spoke. "He's been engaged 3 times before. The first girl, Amanda, ended up in the hospital with mysterious injuries. The second one, Patricia, disappeared completely. Her family says she moved to Europe, but no one has heard from her in 2 years. The third—" Caroline's voice broke. "The third one, Rebecca, killed herself rather than go through with the wedding." The rain drummed against the roof of Ryan's Honda as he processed this information. This wasn't just about money or family pressure. This was about a woman's life, possibly her survival. His protective instincts, honed by years of Coast Guard rescues and sharpened by fatherhood, crystallized into absolute certainty. "We're leaving," Ryan said simply. right now." Caroline's eyes widened. "I can't ask you to do that. Those men, they're dangerous. My grandfather has resources, connections. He could make your life very difficult." Ryan thought about Lily, safe at Mrs. Patterson's house, probably finishing her math homework at the kitchen table. He thought about his job at Henderson Hardware, his evening shifts at the marina, the careful balance of survival he'd built for himself and his daughter. Getting involved in Ashford family business could destroy all of that. Then he looked at Caroline's face, saw the same desperation he'd seen in the eyes of drowning sailors he'd pulled from stormy seas, and knew that some choices weren't really choices at all. "Get in the car," he said. Caroline hesitated for just a moment, then opened the passenger door and slid inside. Ryan walked around to the driver's side, very aware that the three men in the sedan were watching his every move. As he started the engine, his phone buzzed with an incoming call from an unknown number. "Don't answer that," Caroline said quickly. "They'll try to negotiate, make promises, threaten you. They're very good at getting what they want." Ryan ignored the phone and put the Honda in reverse. The sedan immediately started moving toward them, but Ryan had spent years navigating Coast Guard vessels through dangerous waters, and a parking lot in Millbrook Harbor was considerably less challenging than the North Atlantic in a storm. He backed up quickly, spun the wheel hard to the left, and accelerated toward the exit before the sedan could block their path. In his rearview mirror, he could see the three men scrambling to follow, but Ryan's Honda might have been old and battered, but it was also light and maneuverable. More importantly, Ryan knew every street in Millbrook Harbor like the back of his hand. "Where are we going?" Caroline asked, clutching the door handle as Ryan took a sharp right onto Harbor Street. "Somewhere safe," Ryan replied, checking his mirrors again. The sedan was still following, but Ryan was already 3 moves ahead. He took another quick turn onto Fisherman's Lane, a narrow road that led down to the old fishing docks, where his evening job gave him access to areas most people never saw. The marina at night was a maze of shadows and water, with dozens of boats moored in slips that created a labyrinth of hiding places. Ryan parked behind the harbor master's office, a small building that was locked up tight at this hour. The sedan couldn't follow them here without going through the marina's main gate, which was secured after business hours. "They'll have to follow us on foot if they want to find us here," Ryan explained, turning off the engine. "And I know this place better than they do." Caroline was staring at him with something approaching awe. "Why are you doing this? You don't even know me." Ryan was quiet for a moment, listening to the rain drum against the roof of his car and the distant sound of waves lapping against the docks. "I have a daughter," he said finally. "She's 7 years old, and she's the most important thing in my life. Every night when I put her to bed, she asks me if I helped anyone that day. It's this thing she does. She wants to know that her daddy made the world a little bit better." He turned to look at Caroline, this young woman whose life had been derailed by other people's greed and ambition. "Tonight, when Lily asks me that question, I want to be able to tell her yes. I want to tell her that I helped someone who needed it, even when it was complicated, even when it was scary." Caroline's eyes filled with tears. "You could lose everything because of this." "Maybe," Ryan admitted, "but I'd lose something more important if I walked away. I'd lose the ability to look my daughter in the eye and tell her that doing the right thing matters more than doing the easy thing." As if summoned by his words, Ryan's phone buzzed again. This time it was Mrs. Patterson's number. "I should take this," Ryan said, answering the call. "Hello? Ryan, dear, is everything all right?" Mrs. Patterson's elderly voice was tinged with concern. "Lily's been asking when you're coming home, and there are some men here asking questions about you." Ryan's blood ran cold. "What kind of men?" "Well-dressed fellows in a fancy car. They said they were friends of yours, but something about them didn't sit right with me. I didn't tell them anything, of course, but they seemed very interested in Lily." The threat was clear and immediate. Theodore Ashford's men had found his address, discovered his daughter, and were using her as leverage. Ryan felt a rage building in his chest that he hadn't experienced since the night Emma died, a cold, focused fury at people who would threaten an innocent child to get what they wanted. "Mrs. Patterson, I need you to listen to me very carefully," Ryan said, his voice deadly calm. "Take Lily to your back bedroom and lock the door. Don't open it for anyone except me. If those men try to get into your house, call 911 immediately." "Oh my," Mrs. Patterson whispered. "Ryan, what's happening?" "I'll explain everything later. Just keep Lily safe. I'm coming home right now." Ryan hung up and turned to Caroline, who had gone pale as she overheard the conversation. "They found your daughter," she said, her voice hollow with guilt and fear. "Yeah, they did," Ryan replied grimly, "which means this isn't just about helping a stranger anymore. They made it personal when they threatened my little girl." Caroline was crying now, tears of shame and terror streaming down her face. "I'm so sorry. I never wanted anyone else to get hurt. Maybe I should just go back, marry Jeremy, accept what grandfather wants." "No," Ryan said firmly. "Running away from bullies doesn't make them stop being bullies. It just teaches them that threats work." He started the Honda's engine again, his jaw set with determination. "Besides, I've got a few advantages they don't know about." "What kind of advantages?" Ryan smiled grimly as he put the car in drive. "I'm a single father in a small town. That means I know every parent, every teacher, every coach, and every police officer in Millbrook Harbor. More importantly, they know me. They know I'm one of the good guys." As they drove back toward town through the storm, Ryan was already making plans. The Ashfords might have money and influence, but Ryan Torres had something more valuable in a crisis. He had a community that trusted him, and he was about to put that trust to the ultimate test. "Yakuna. Caroline," he said as they approached the streetlights of downtown Millbrook Harbor. "I hope you're ready for this to get complicated, because we're not just running anymore. We're fighting back." The morning after the storm brought deceptive calm to Millbrook Harbor, with golden sunlight streaming through Ryan's apartment windows and the sound of seagulls crying over waters that had been churning with fury just hours before. But inside the small kitchen on Seabird Street, the tension was thick enough to cut with a knife, as Ryan sat across from Caroline Ashford, both of them nursing cups of coffee, and trying to process the magnitude of what they'd gotten themselves into. Lily had left for school 20 minutes earlier, chattering excitedly about the sleepover guest who had spent the night on their couch, completely unaware that her father had just declared war on one of the most powerful families in New England. Mrs. Patterson had agreed to walk Lily to school and pick her up afterward, creating a buffer of normalcy while Ryan figured out their next move. Caroline looked different in the morning light, wearing one of Emma's old sweaters that Ryan had retrieved from the closet he rarely opened anymore. The elegant bones of her face were more apparent without the dramatic makeup and elaborate hairstyle from her wedding day, and Ryan found himself thinking that she looked younger, more vulnerable, but also somehow stronger than the terrified woman he'd rescued from the parking lot. "They'll come for me today," Caroline said quietly, wrapping her hands around her coffee mug as if its warmth could ward off the cold reality of their situation. "Grandfather doesn't tolerate defiance, especially not from family members. He'll view what happened last night as a direct challenge to his authority." Ryan had been thinking the same thing. Theodore Ashford hadn't built a shipping empire by accepting defeat gracefully, and having his granddaughter spirited away by a hardware store clerk would be seen as an intolerable insult to his power and prestige. The question wasn't whether Ashford would retaliate, it was how brutal that retaliation would be. "Tell me about your grandfather," Ryan said, settling back in his chair. "Not the public version, not the philanthropist who donates to the hospital and has his name on half the buildings in town. Tell me about the man who would force his granddaughter to marry someone she's terrified of." Caroline was quiet for a long moment, staring into her coffee as if the dark liquid might hold answers to questions she'd been afraid to ask her entire life. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the weight of years of carefully buried pain. "Theodore Ashford is a man who believes that people are assets to be managed and deployed for maximum efficiency," she said slowly. "He bought my parents when I was 3 years old. Not literally, of course, but he might as well have. My father had gambling debts that were about to destroy him, and my mother came from old Boston money that had been reduced to nothing but a prestigious name. Grandfather paid off father's debts and gave mother access to the lifestyle she'd grown up expecting, and in exchange, they signed over their parental rights to him." Ryan felt his jaw clench. "They sold you." "They preferred to think of it as securing my future," Caroline replied with bitter humor. "I was raised in the Ashford mansion on Beacon Hill, given the finest education money could buy, taught French and piano and all the social graces that would make me a suitable wife for whatever business arrangement grandfather chose to make. My parents became distant figures who appeared at Christmas dinner and occasional charity events, playing their roles as the devoted family while grandfather controlled every aspect of my life. The picture Caroline was painting was one of gilded captivity, of a childhood spent as a pawn in someone else's chess game. Ryan thought about Lily's laughter echoing through their small apartment, about the way she felt free to express every emotion and opinion that crossed her 7-year-old mind, and he felt a surge of protective fury toward this woman who had never been allowed such simple freedoms. "When did you find out about Jeremy?" he asked. Caroline's hands tightened around her mug. 6 months ago, on my 25th birthday. Grandfather called me into his study and explained that he'd been negotiating a merger with the Blackstone shipping interests, and that my marriage to Jeremy would be the cornerstone of the deal. He presented it as if he was giving me a wonderful gift, a chance to contribute meaningfully to the family business. "And when you objected?" "I was told that objecting wasn't an option," Caroline said flatly. Grandfather explained that I had been raised at considerable expense for exactly this purpose, and that my personal feelings about the arrangement were irrelevant. He said that every woman in our family had made similar sacrifices for the greater good, and that it was simply my turn to do my duty. Ryan could hear the echo of institutional cruelty in Caroline's matter-of-fact tone, the way abuse victims often recounted their experiences with the same emotional distance they might use to read a shopping list. It was a defense mechanism he'd seen before in his Coast Guard days, when they'd rescued people from situations that had pushed them beyond their capacity to process trauma normally. "But you researched Jeremy anyway," Ryan said, remembering her knowledge of his previous engagements. "I hired a private investigator with money I'd saved from the allowance grandfather gave me," Caroline admitted. "I wanted to know who I was being sold to. What I found out?" She shuddered. "Jeremy Blackstone is a sociopath who views women as disposable objects. The investigator couldn't prove that he killed Amanda or Patricia, but the evidence was compelling enough to terrify me." "Why didn't you take that evidence to the police?" Caroline laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "With what authority? I'm not even technically an adult in grandfather's eyes. He's been my legal guardian since I was 3, with power of attorney over all my affairs. The trust fund that's supposed to be mine when I turn 30? He controls it completely. The apartment I live in, the car I drive, even the credit cards I use. Everything belongs to him. I have no legal standing, no financial independence, no way to prove that I'm being coerced rather than simply being a dutiful granddaughter." The scope of Theodore Ashford's control was breathtaking in its completeness. He had created a prison without bars, a system of dependency so total that his granddaughter couldn't escape even when her life was literally at stake. It was the kind of methodical psychological manipulation that spoke to decades of practice. "How many other granddaughters have there been?" Ryan asked quietly. 2, Caroline whispered. "My cousin Margaret was married off to a steel magnate's son when she was 22. She died in a skiing accident in Switzerland 3 years later, though the private investigator found evidence that her husband had been beating her regularly. My cousin Diana was married to a telecommunications heir when she was 24. She developed a drinking problem that killed her before she turned 30. And your grandfather sees this as acceptable collateral damage." "He sees this as the cost of doing business," Caroline corrected. "Grandfather has a saying, Ashford women are bred to build empires, not to chase fairy tales. He genuinely believes that our personal happiness is a small price to pay for the family's continued prosperity." Ryan stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the harbor where fishing boats were heading out for their morning runs. The normalcy of the scene, weathered men doing honest work to feed their families, stood in stark contrast to the twisted world of manipulation and abuse that Caroline was describing. "There's something else," Caroline said hesitantly. "Something I haven't told you yet." Ryan turned back to face her, noting the fresh anxiety in her expression. "What is it?" "The inheritance you heard those men mention last night, the $500 million. It's not from grandfather's shipping business. It's from my maternal grandmother's trust fund, which becomes mine when I turn 30, or when I marry, whichever comes first. Grandfather has been managing it since I was a child, but legally, he can't access it permanently unless I either die or sign it over to him voluntarily." The pieces of the puzzle clicked into place with sickening clarity. "So if you marry Jeremy and then have an accident like your cousins..." The inheritance would go to my husband, who would then be obligated to honor certain business arrangements with grandfather, Caroline finished. It's not just about the shipping merger. It's about grandfather gaining permanent control over $500 million that was never his to begin with. Ryan felt the world shift beneath his feet as he realized the true scope of what they were facing. This wasn't just about a young woman's right to choose her own husband. This was about a conspiracy that had already cost 2 lives and was about to claim a third. Theodore Ashford wasn't just a controlling grandfather. He was a man who had built his empire on the literal graves of his own family members. "Caroline," Ryan said slowly, "what happened to your grandmother's will, the original document that established the trust?" "I don't know," Caroline admitted. "I've never been allowed to see it. Grandfather says it's locked away in the family's legal archives, but I've always wondered if there might be provisions in it that he doesn't want me to know about." Ryan's mind was racing now, connecting dots and forming strategies with the same methodical precision that had made him an effective Coast Guard rescue swimmer. If Caroline's grandmother had been as wealthy and sophisticated as her trust fund suggested, there was a good chance she had included safeguards in her will, provisions that would protect her granddaughter from exactly the kind of manipulation Theodore Ashford had been perpetrating for decades. "We need to get our hands on that will," Ryan said, "and we need to do it before your grandfather realizes how much you've figured out about his plans." Caroline looked at him with a mixture of hope and terror. That would mean breaking into grandfather's private files. The legal documents are kept in a vault at the Ashford mansion, protected by security systems that cost more than most people's houses. "Then it's a good thing I used to specialize in dangerous rescues," Ryan replied grimly, "because that's exactly what this is, a rescue operation. We're just rescuing you from your own family instead of from stormy seas." As if summoned by their conversation, Ryan's phone rang. The caller ID showed a number he didn't recognize, but Caroline went pale when she saw it. "That's grandfather's private line," she whispered. "He only uses it when he's making threats he doesn't want recorded on his regular business phones." Ryan answered the call, putting it on speaker so Caroline could hear both sides of the conversation. "Mr. Torres," came a cultured voice that somehow managed to sound both warm and absolutely menacing. "This is Theodore Ashford. I believe you have something that belongs to me." "I have someone who belongs to herself," Ryan replied calmly, "and she's chosen not to be with you." Ashford's chuckle was like ice cracking. "Mr. Torres, I've taken the liberty of learning quite a bit about you in the past few hours. Single father, works 2 jobs to support his daughter, lives paycheck to paycheck in a rented apartment. A man in your position can't afford to make enemies of people like me." "A man in my position can't afford not to do the right thing," Ryan replied, "especially when that man has a daughter who's watching how he handles himself when things get difficult." "Ah yes, Lily," Ashford said, and Ryan felt his blood turn to ice. 7 years old, attends Millbrook Elementary, walks to school every morning at exactly 7:45. Such a precious child. It would be tragic if something were to happen to her because her father made poor choices about who to trust. The threat hung in the air like poison gas, and Ryan felt every protective instinct he possessed crystallize into diamond-hard resolve. Theodore Ashford had just made the mistake of threatening the one person in the world that Ryan would die to protect. "Mr. Ashford," Ryan said, his voice deadly quiet, "if you or anyone working for you comes within 100 yards of my daughter, I will make it my life's mission to destroy everything you've built. And before you remind me how powerful you are, let me remind you of something. I spent 8 years in the Coast Guard, pulling people out of situations they thought they couldn't survive. I know exactly how to make someone disappear in these waters, and I know exactly how to make it look like an accident." The line went silent for a long moment. When Ashford spoke again, his voice had lost its veneer of civility. "You have until noon to return my granddaughter, Mr. Torres. After that, the consequences will be entirely on your head." The line went dead, leaving Ryan and Caroline staring at each other across the small kitchen table as the morning sunlight streamed through windows that suddenly felt far too exposed. "He's gonna come after Lily," Caroline said, her voice hollow with guilt and terror. "Yes, he is," Ryan agreed. "Which means we're going to have to move faster than he expects and hit him where he doesn't see it coming." Ryan looked at his watch, 9:30 a.m. They had 2.5 hours to do the impossible. Break into one of the most secure private residences in New England, steal legal documents that could bring down a shipping empire, and somehow keep a 7-year-old girl safe from men who had already killed twice to protect their secrets. It should have been terrifying. Instead, Ryan Torres felt the familiar calm that had always settled over him before the most dangerous rescues of his Coast Guard career. He had a mission now, clear and simple: protect the innocent and stop the predators. Everything else was just logistics. "Caroline," he said, standing up from the table, "I hope you remember the layout of your grandfather's house, because we're about to pull off the most important burglary in Millbrook Harbor's history." The Ashford mansion sat like a Gothic fortress on the highest hill overlooking Millbrook Harbor, its gray stone walls and towering spires designed to intimidate anyone who dared approach uninvited. Ryan had driven past it countless times over the years, but he'd never really looked at it. Not the way he was looking at it now, through the eyes of someone planning to break in and steal what might be the most important documents on the East Coast. Caroline sat beside him in the Honda, studying the mansion's imposing facade with the focused intensity of someone trying to remember details that could mean the difference between success and catastrophe. They were parked on Harborview Drive, about 200 yards from the main gate, close enough to observe but far enough away to avoid the security cameras that Caroline had warned him about. "The main entrance is obviously out of the question," Caroline said quietly, pointing toward the massive iron gates that guarded the mansion's circular driveway. "There are guards posted there 24 hours a day, and the cameras have facial recognition software that would identify me before we got within 50 feet of the house." Ryan nodded, his Coast Guard training automatically cataloging escape routes and potential obstacles. "What about service entrances?" "There's a delivery gate on the east side that the staff uses, but it's also monitored. The kitchen entrance has motion sensors, and the staff quarters have their own security system." Caroline paused, then pointed toward a section of the property that was partially hidden by ancient oak trees. "But there's an old storm drain that runs under the foundation. It was part of the original construction from the 1890s, and I don't think Grandfather even remembers it exists." "You know about it, Hal?" Caroline's expression grew distant. "When I was 12, I found the building plans in the library. I used to fantasize about escape routes, ways I could run away without anyone knowing how I'd gotten out. I explored every inch of that house, looking for freedom that I never had the courage to take." Ryan studied the terrain between their position and the area Caroline had indicated. The storm drain would be hidden from the main security installations, but reaching it would require crossing open ground, where they'd be visible to anyone watching from the house. More problematically, they'd have to do it in broad daylight. There wasn't time to wait for darkness, with Theodore Ashford's noon deadline hanging over them. "How do we get to the vault once we're inside?" Ryan asked. "Grandfather's study is on the second floor, in the north wing. The vault is hidden behind a bookshelf. It looks like part of the wall, but there's a section of books that swings open when you press the right sequence. The combination is—" Caroline hesitated, then looked embarrassed. "It's my birthday. Grandfather always said I was his most valuable asset, so he used my birth date as the code for his most valuable documents." The psychological manipulation embedded in that detail made Ryan's stomach turn. Theodore Ashford had turned his granddaughter's very existence into a symbol of his control over her life, reducing her to a number sequence that unlocked his secrets. It was the kind of casual cruelty that spoke to decades of viewing people as objects rather than human beings. "What about security inside the house?" Ryan pressed. "Motion sensors in the main hallways, but they're turned off during the day when staff are moving around. The study itself has a pressure plate under the rug in front of the desk, but I know where it is. The real problem is going to be getting there without being seen by the servants or any of Grandfather's business associates who might be visiting." Ryan checked his watch, 10:15 a.m. They had less than 2 hours to execute a plan that would have challenged a team of professional thieves. And they were going to attempt it with no equipment, no backup, and no margin for error. Under normal circumstances, it would have been suicide. But these weren't normal circumstances. They were fighting for Caroline's life and Lily's safety, and that changed everything. "There's something else we need to consider," Ryan said grimly. "Your grandfather isn't going to be sitting around waiting for noon to arrive. He's going to be making moves, putting pressure on anyone he thinks might help us. We need to assume that every phone call is monitored, every friend is compromised, and every safe place has been identified by his people." Caroline nodded, understanding the implications, which means we can't go back to your apartment, and we can't rely on anyone else in town for help. We're completely on our own. Not completely, Ryan said, a plan beginning to form in his mind. But we're going to have to trust people in a way that puts them at risk, which goes against every instinct I have about protecting innocent bystanders. He pulled out his phone and dialed a number he knew by heart. After 3 rings, a familiar voice answered. Henderson Hardware, this is Pete. Pete, it's Ryan. I need a favor, and I need you to not ask questions about why. Pete Henderson had been Ryan's boss at the hardware store for almost 2 years, and in that time he'd proven himself to be the kind of man who judged people by their actions rather than their circumstances. He'd given Ryan the job when no one else would hire a former Coast Guard officer with no retail experience, and he'd never once made Ryan feel like charity case despite the obvious financial struggles. What do you need, Ryan? I need you to pick up Lily from school at the regular time and keep her at the store until I call you. Don't let her go with anyone else, not even if they say they're police officers or that I sent them. Can you do that? Pete was quiet for a moment, processing the request and the obvious desperation in Ryan's voice. Son, are you in some kind of trouble? The kind of trouble where a 7-year-old girl's safety depends on whether the adults in her life are willing to do the right thing without asking for explanations, Ryan said carefully. Pete, I've never asked you for anything beyond honest work for honest pay. I'm asking now. Consider it done, Pete said without hesitation. Lily will be safe at the store until you come for her. And Ryan? Whatever you're dealing with, you don't have to face it alone. This town has more good people in it than bad ones. Ryan felt a surge of gratitude that almost overwhelmed him. In a world where Theodore Ashford could buy cooperation and silence with money and threats, having someone willing to help based purely on trust felt like finding water in a desert. Thank you, Pete. I won't forget this. Just make sure you and that little girl stay safe. Everything else is just details. Ryan hung up and turned to Caroline, who had been listening to the conversation with growing amazement. He didn't even hesitate, she said wonderingly. He doesn't know what you're involved in, doesn't know what kind of danger he might be putting himself in, but he just said yes. That's what people do when they care about each other, Ryan replied. It's what community means. Your grandfather might have money and power, but he doesn't have that. He doesn't have people who would risk everything for him just because he's a good man who deserves help. Caroline was staring at Ryan with an expression he couldn't quite read. You realize that what we're about to do could destroy your life even if we succeed? Grandfather doesn't forgive people who cross him, and he has a very long memory for revenge. Then we'd better make sure we get enough evidence to destroy him first, Ryan said grimly. Because you're right. After today, there's no going back to the way things were. This ends with either Theodore Ashford in prison or us in graves. The stark reality of their situation settled between them like a weight. They were about to commit multiple felonies against one of the most powerful men in New England, and they were doing it with nothing but hope and desperation as their weapons. If they failed, Caroline would be forced into a marriage that would likely kill her, Lily would grow up without a father, and Theodore Ashford would continue using his family members as currency in his business deals. But if they succeeded, if they could find the evidence they needed to prove that Theodore Ashford had been systematically murdering his own granddaughters for their inheritance money, then they might be able to stop a cycle of abuse that had been going on for decades. Carolyn, Ryan said, starting the Honda's engine, I need you to tell me everything you remember about the layout of that house. Every room, every hallway, every possible hiding place. Because we're not just breaking in to steal documents, we're breaking in to save your life. As they drove toward the mansion, Caroline began sketching a rough floor plan on the back of an envelope she'd found in Ryan's glove compartment. Her hands shook slightly as she drew, but her voice was steady as she described the Gothic maze that had been her prison for most of her life. The servants' quarters are in the basement, along with the wine cellar and storage rooms. The main floor has the formal dining room, the ballroom, the conservatory, and grandfather's business offices. The second floor has the family bedrooms and the study where the vault is located. The third floor is mostly unused now. It used to house the live-in staff back when the mansion was built. Security checkpoints? The main staircase has cameras, but the service stairs don't. There's a back stairway that the maids use that goes directly from the kitchen to the second floor without passing through any of the main rooms. If we can get to the kitchen without being seen, we should be able to reach the study without encountering anyone. Ryan studied the sketch, his mind automatically calculating angles of approach and potential escape routes. The mansion was a fortress, but every fortress had weaknesses, points where the builders had prioritized grandeur over security, or where decades of modifications had created blind spots in the surveillance network. "The storm drain you mentioned," Ryan said, pointing to the eastern edge of Caroline's sketch. "Where does it emerge inside the house?" "In the basement, near the old coal cellar. There's a grate that opens from the inside. It was designed to allow workers to clear debris from the drain without going outside. I used to hide down there when I was little, when grandfather was having one of his rages about business deals or family obligations." Ryan felt another surge of anger at the image of a young Caroline cowering in a basement, while the man who was supposed to protect her terrorized her from above. But he channeled that anger into focus, using it to sharpen his resolve and clarify his thinking. "Once we have the documents, how do we get out?" "The same way we came in, if possible. But if that's compromised?" Caroline pointed to another section of her sketch. "There's a balcony off the master bedroom that connects to the fire escape. It's supposed to be for emergencies only, but it would get us to the ground without having to go back through the house." They were approaching the turnoff for Harborview Drive, the road that would take them within sight of the mansion's imposing walls. Ryan felt the familiar calm settling over him that had always preceded his most dangerous Coast Guard rescues, the sense of time slowing down and priorities crystallizing into perfect clarity. "Caroline," he said quietly, "once we go through with this, your life is never going to be the same. Even if we succeed, even if we bring down your grandfather's empire, you're going to have to rebuild everything from scratch. Are you ready for that?" Caroline looked at him with eyes that held more determination than fear for the first time since he'd met her. "Ryan, for the first time in my life, I'm going to have a life that's actually mine. Whatever comes after that, I can handle it. The question is whether you're ready to risk everything for someone you barely know." Ryan thought about Lily, safe at Henderson Hardware with Pete watching over her. He thought about Emma, who had always believed that good people had an obligation to help each other when the world got dark and dangerous. He thought about the two young women who had died because no one had been willing to stand between them and Theodore Ashford's greed. "I'm ready," he said simply, and turned the Honda toward the mansion where they would either find the evidence to save Caroline's life or die trying. The storm drain was exactly where Caroline remembered it, hidden beneath a tangle of overgrown ivy at the base of the mansion's eastern wall. Ryan had to crawl on his hands and knees to reach the entrance, his clothes soaking through as he pushed aside decades of accumulated leaves and debris. The iron grate was old and rusted, but it swung open on hinges that had been oiled more recently than the rest of the mechanism suggested. Someone had been maintaining this entrance, which meant either Theodore Ashford knew about it or one of his staff had been using it for purposes of their own. "It's clear," Ryan whispered back to Caroline, who was crouched behind a massive oak tree, watching for any sign that they'd been spotted. "But someone's been keeping this operational. We need to assume we might not be the only ones who know about it." Caroline crawled forward to join him at the drain entrance, her borrowed clothes already muddy from their approach across the mansion's grounds. "Maybe it's one of the gardeners. They might use it to access the irrigation system. Or maybe your grandfather is more paranoid than you thought, and he's been maintaining escape routes of his own," Ryan replied grimly. "Either way, we're committed now." The storm drain was larger than Ryan had expected, wide enough for them to crawl through without having to squeeze. But it was also pitch black, and the sound of their movement echoed off the stone walls in ways that made him nervous about detection. If anyone was monitoring the basement area with sensitive equipment, their approach would be impossible to hide. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, they reached the interior grate that Caroline had described. Ryan could see light filtering through the iron bars, and he could hear the distant sounds of a house in operation, footsteps, voices, the hum of machinery that kept a mansion running. "The coast is clear," Caroline whispered, peering through the grate into the basement corridor beyond. "But we need to move fast. The staff serves lunch at 11:30, which means everyone will be moving around upstairs in about 20 minutes. Ryan pushed open the interior grate and crawled into the mansion's basement, finally able to stand upright in a space that looked like it belonged in a medieval castle rather than a private home. The walls were made of the same gray stone as the exterior, and the ceiling was supported by massive wooden beams that had probably been hewn from trees that were centuries old. "The service stairs are this way," Caroline said, leading him through a maze of storage rooms and mechanical equipment toward a narrow staircase that disappeared into the darkness above. 2 flights up, then a left turn. Then the study is the third door on the right. As they climbed the servants' stairs, Ryan could hear the mansion coming to life around them. Voices echoed from distant rooms, footsteps moved across floors above them, and somewhere in the depths of the house, a grandfather clock chimed the half-hour. 10:30 a.m., 90 minutes until Theodore Ashford's deadline, and they were just now reaching the second floor where their real work would begin. At the top of the stairs, Caroline held up a hand for silence and pressed her ear to the door that opened onto the main corridor. After a moment, she nodded and slowly turned the handle, opening the door just enough to peer into the hallway beyond. "Empty," she whispered. "But grandfather's voice is coming from the business office downstairs. He's on a conference call, probably making arrangements for what happens if we don't show up by noon." They slipped into the corridor, their footsteps muffled by an antique Persian rug that probably cost more than Ryan's annual salary. The hallway was lined with oil paintings of stern-faced Ashford ancestors, all of whom seemed to be staring down at the intruders with expressions of aristocratic disapproval. The study door was exactly where Caroline had said it would be, made of dark wood and fitted with a lock that looked like it belonged in a museum. But when Caroline tried the handle, it turned easily. "Grandfather never locks it during the day," she explained quietly. "He says that anyone brave enough to steal from Theodore Ashford deserves whatever they can carry." The study was a monument to wealth and power, with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, a massive mahogany desk, and windows that offered a commanding view of Millbrook Harbor spread out below. But Ryan's attention was focused entirely on the section of bookshelf that Caroline was approaching, her fingers trailing along the leather spines until she found the sequence she was looking for. "Here," she whispered, pressing a series of books in a pattern that Ryan couldn't follow. There was a soft click, and a section of the bookshelf swung inward to reveal a steel vault door that looked like it belonged in a bank rather than a private home. Caroline approached the electronic keypad beside the vault door and entered her birthdate with fingers that shook only slightly. The lock disengaged with a soft hum, and the heavy door swung open to reveal shelves lined with documents, jewelry, and what looked like enough cash to buy a small country. "The legal documents are on the top shelf," Caroline said, reaching for a leather portfolio that was thick with papers. "Everything about the family trusts, the wills, the business contracts." She pulled out the portfolio and opened it, revealing documents that were yellowed with age and covered in the elaborate legal language of a previous century. But as Caroline flipped through the pages, her expression changed from hope to confusion, to something approaching shock. "This isn't right," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "This isn't grandmother's will at all. This is something else entirely." Ryan looked over her shoulder at the document she was holding, and even his layman's understanding of legal language was enough to recognize what they were looking at. It wasn't a will or a trust document or anything having to do with inheritance money. It was a murder confession, signed by Theodore Ashford and dated 3 years ago, the same year that Caroline's cousin Diana had died of her supposed drinking problem. "Caroline," Ryan said quietly, "I think we just found something much more important than your grandmother's will." From somewhere in the house below them came the sound of Theodore Ashford's voice, no longer muffled by distance and closed doors. He was finished with his conference call, and he was coming upstairs. Caroline's hands trembled as she held the confession letter, her face draining of all color as she read the methodical details of how her grandfather had orchestrated Diana's death. The document was written in Theodore Ashford's precise handwriting, every word carefully chosen to describe the systematic poisoning that had been disguised as alcoholism, the forged medical records that had hidden the true cause of death, and the substantial payments made to ensure that the right people remained silent. But what made Ryan's blood run cold wasn't just the clinical description of murder. It was the casual notation at the bottom of the page that mentioned similar arrangements for Margaret and referenced a 3-phase plan for asset consolidation through strategic family management. "He killed them all," Carolyn whispered, her voice barely audible. "Margaret, Diana, and he's been planning to kill me from the beginning." The sound of Theodore Ashford's footsteps grew louder, accompanied by voices that Ryan didn't recognize. He grabbed Caroline's arm and pulled her deeper into the vault, scanning the shelves for anything else that might be useful. His eyes landed on a small digital recorder that was sitting beside a stack of business contracts. "Take that," he whispered urgently, pointing to the recorder. "And grab whatever other documents you can carry. We need to get out of here now." Caroline stuffed the confession letter and several other papers into the leather portfolio while Ryan pocketed the recorder and a small address book that looked like it might contain contact information for Ashford's various accomplices. The voices in the hallway were getting closer, and Ryan could make out at least 3 different speakers, Theodore Ashford, and 2 men whose voices he didn't recognize. "The service stairs," Carolyn whispered, closing the vault door as quietly as possible. "If we can make it back to the stairwell, we can." The study door opened. Ryan and Caroline froze behind the partially open bookshelf as Theodore Ashford entered his study, followed by 2 men in expensive suits, who looked like they could have been brothers to the ones who had chased Caroline through the parking lot the night before. Ryan held his breath and pressed himself against the wall of the vault, praying that the angle of the bookshelf would hide them from view. "The situation has become more complicated than I anticipated," Ashford was saying, his cultured voice carrying the same cold authority that Ryan had heard over the phone. "Mr. Torres is proving to be more resourceful than his background suggested, and Caroline appears to have developed a backbone at the most inconvenient possible time. We could handle both problems permanently," suggested one of the men, his voice carrying a Boston accent and the kind of casual menace that came from years of solving problems through violence. "Make it look like a murder-suicide. Desperate single father kills heiress and then himself. The media would eat it up." "Too messy," Ashford replied dismissively. "And it would draw exactly the kind of attention we've spent years avoiding. No, we need something more subtle. Something that looks like an accident, but sends a clear message to anyone else who might be tempted to interfere in family business." Ryan felt Caroline tense beside him as they listened to these men discuss their deaths with the same detached professionalism that other people might use to plan a business meeting. But what struck him most was Theodore Ashford's complete lack of emotion when talking about murdering his own granddaughter. This wasn't a man driven by rage or desperation. This was someone who viewed murder as just another tool in his business arsenal. "What about the daughter?" asked the second man. 7 years old, you said. Could be useful leverage if Torres continues to be uncooperative." "Children are unpredictable variables," Ashford said thoughtfully. "They scream. They run to neighbors. They tell teachers things they shouldn't know. But you're right that she represents our best point of pressure on Mr. Torres. A man will risk his own life for principle, but he'll surrender everything to protect his child." Ryan's jaw clenched as he listened to these monsters discuss using Lily as a weapon against him. Every protective instinct he possessed was screaming at him to burst out of the vault and attack them with his bare hands. But his Coast Guard training held him in check. Getting himself killed in a hopeless fight wouldn't protect his daughter or save Caroline. It would just eliminate the only people who knew the truth about Theodore Ashford's crimes. "Have you made contact with our friend at Child Protective Services?" Ashford continued. "Everything's arranged," the first man confirmed. "Anonymous tip about an unfit father who's involved with dangerous criminals. Once the girl is in state custody, Torres will do whatever we ask to get her back." The casual corruption embedded in that statement was breathtaking. Theodore Ashford had bought himself an agent inside the state's child protection system, turning an organization designed to help vulnerable children into another weapon in his arsenal of control. Ryan wondered how many other officials Ashford owned, how many other systems had been corrupted by his money and influence. "Excellent," Ashford said. "Make the call at exactly noon. By the time Torres realizes what's happening, his daughter will be safely beyond his reach, and Caroline will understand that cooperation is her only option." Caroline's breathing had become shallow and rapid, and Ryan could see that she was on the verge of panic. The reality of her grandfather's planning was overwhelming. He had anticipated their moves, corrupted the systems that should have protected them, and arranged their destruction with the methodical precision of someone who had done this many times before. But Ryan had spent years pulling people out of situations that seemed hopeless, and he knew that panic was the enemy of survival. He reached over and squeezed Caroline's hand, using the pressure to ground her in the present moment and remind her that they weren't helpless yet. "There's one more thing," Ashford said, walking toward his desk. "I've been reviewing the security footage from last night, and I noticed something interesting about Mr. Torres's behavior. He moves like someone with military training, specifically like someone trained in maritime rescue operations." Ryan felt his stomach drop. If Ashford had identified his Coast Guard background, it meant he'd also probably figured out Ryan's tactical advantages and would be planning countermeasures. "Coast Guard," the second man said, obviously reading from some kind of file. 8 years of service, multiple commendations for heroism under fire, specialized training in high-risk rescue operations. No wonder he managed to evade our people last night. "Which means we can't treat him like an ordinary civilian," Ashford observed. "Mr. Torres is trained to think tactically, to improvise under pressure, and to prioritize mission completion over personal safety. He'll be expecting us to come after his daughter, which means he'll have taken precautions." "What kind of precautions?" "The kind that make our noon deadline more complicated than I initially anticipated," Ashford replied grimly, "but also the kind that give us additional opportunities if we're creative about how we exploit them." Ryan heard the sound of papers rustling as Ashford moved around his desk, apparently reviewing documents or maps. The 3 men were standing directly in front of the vault now, close enough that Ryan could smell their expensive cologne and hear the subtle sounds of their breathing. "I want surveillance teams positioned at the hardware store, the elementary school, and every major intersection between here and the harbor," Ashford commanded. "If Torres is as smart as his record suggests, he'll try to retrieve his daughter before we can move against her. When he does, we'll be ready." "And Caroline?" "Caroline will come home when she realizes that her rebellion is putting innocent people in danger," Ashford said with the confidence of someone who had used emotional manipulation as a weapon for decades. "She spent her entire life being trained to put family obligations ahead of personal desires. When she understands that her stubbornness is threatening a child's life, she'll make the right choice." The casual cruelty of using Caroline's own compassion against her was typical of Theodore Ashford's methods, but Ryan could see that the strategy was already working. Caroline's face was etched with guilt and terror as she realized that her attempt at freedom was putting Lily in danger. "Sir," the first man said, his voice carrying a note of urgency, "we have a problem. The vault door is showing as accessed within the last 10 minutes, but the hallway cameras don't show anyone entering or leaving the study." The silence that followed this announcement was deafening. Ryan could practically hear Theodore Ashford's mind working, connecting the dots, and reaching the inevitable conclusion that someone was currently hiding in his private sanctuary. "Gentlemen," Ashford said quietly, his voice taking on the deadly calm of a predator who had just spotted his prey, "I believe we have uninvited guests." Ryan heard the distinctive sound of weapons being drawn, the metallic whisper of guns being pulled from concealed holsters. He looked around the vault desperately, searching for anything that could be used as a weapon or a means of escape, but they were trapped in a steel box with no way out, except through the study, where 3 armed men were waiting for them. "Caroline, dear," Ashford called out, his voice carrying the false warmth of a spider inviting a fly into its web, "I know you're in there. Why don't you come out so we can discuss this like civilized people? There's no need for anyone to get hurt." Caroline looked at Ryan with eyes that held a mixture of terror and resignation. She was ready to surrender, to walk out of the vault and accept whatever fate her grandfather had planned for her. But Ryan had spent too many years saving people from impossible situations to give up now. He pulled out his phone and quickly typed a text message to Pete Henderson. "Emergency, call 911. Tell them shots fired at Ashford Mansion. Send everything they have." He hit send and prayed that his phone's signal was strong enough to get through the mansion's thick walls. "I'm going to count to 10, Ashford announced. "If you're not out here by the time I reach 0, my associates are going to start shooting through the bookshelf. The vault might stop bullets, but the ricochets in that confined space will kill you just as effectively. 1. Ryan grabbed the address book he'd pocketed earlier and quickly flipped through it, looking for anything that might give them leverage. Names, phone numbers, account information, anything that might be valuable enough to trade for their lives. 2. Caroline was crying silently, her face streaked with tears as she clutched the leather portfolio containing her grandfather's confession. She mouthed the words, "I'm sorry," to Ryan, and he could see that she was preparing to sacrifice herself to save him and Lily. 3. Ryan found what he was looking for, a phone number listed under insurance policy with a note that read, "Final contingency. Use only if exposure imminent." He didn't know what it meant, but anything labeled as Theodore Ashford's insurance policy had to be significant. 4. "Mr. Ashford," Ryan called out, his voice carrying the calm authority he'd learned in the Coast Guard. "Before you do something we'll all regret, you might want to know that we found more than just Caroline in here." The counting stopped. "We found your confession about Diana," Ryan continued. "We found the financial records showing payments to coroners and police officers. And we found your insurance policy contact information. I'm guessing that whoever you call when you need final contingency help might be very interested to know that their services are about to be exposed." The silence stretched out for what felt like hours but was probably only seconds. Ryan could hear Theodore Ashford breathing heavily, could sense the older man's mind racing as he tried to calculate the implications of his secrets being discovered. "You're bluffing," Ashford said finally, but there was uncertainty in his voice for the first time. "Am I?" Ryan replied. "Caroline, read him the first paragraph of that confession. Let him decide if we're bluffing." Caroline's voice shook as she began to read. "I, Theodore Ashford, being of sound mind and under no external coercion, do hereby confess to the premeditated murder of my granddaughter Diana Elizabeth Ashford, carried out through the systematic administration of—" "Stop!" Ashford commanded, his voice sharp with panic. "That's enough." Ryan could hear whispered conversations outside the vault as the three men tried to figure out their next move. They had come here expecting to corner a desperate woman and an amateur Good Samaritan, but instead, they had walked into a situation where their intended victims held enough evidence to destroy everything Theodore Ashford had built. "Here's what's going to happen," Ryan announced. "We're walking out of here with these documents, and you're going to let us go. Because if anything happens to us, copies of everything we found are going to every newspaper, police department, and federal agency on the East Coast." It wasn't true. They hadn't had time to make copies of anything, but Theodore Ashford didn't know that. And judging by the increasingly frantic whispered conversations outside the vault, the bluff was working. "You don't understand the forces you're dealing with," Ashford said, but his voice had lost its earlier confidence. "There are people involved in this who make me look like a Sunday school teacher. If you expose this, you'll bring down more than just my business. You'll destroy systems that keep this entire region stable." "Then maybe those systems deserve to be destroyed," Ryan replied grimly. As if summoned by his words, the distant sound of sirens began to wail across Millbrook Harbor, growing louder as they approached the mansion on the hill. Ryan's text message had gotten through, and the cavalry was finally coming. But as the sirens grew closer, Ryan realized that their real problems were just beginning. Because Theodore Ashford was right about one thing. They were dealing with forces much larger and more dangerous than they had imagined, and exposing the truth was going to put them in the crosshairs of people who had far more to lose than one corrupt businessman. The war for Caroline's freedom was about to become a battle for their very lives. The sirens were getting closer, but instead of relief, Ryan felt a growing sense of unease as he listened to Theodore Ashford's reaction to the approaching police. Rather than panic or anger, the old man was laughing, a low, bitter sound that spoke of someone who held cards that others couldn't see. "You really think the Millbrook Harbor Police Department is going to save you?" Ashford asked, his voice regaining its earlier confidence. "Mr. Torres, you have no idea how deep this goes. The police chief, the mayor, half the town council, they all owe their positions to Ashford money and influence. When those officers arrive, they're not coming to rescue you. They're coming to clean up a mess." Caroline's face went pale as the implications hit her. "He's right," she whispered to Ryan. "Grandfather doesn't just own businesses. He owns people. Everyone from the bank president to the harbor master to the school superintendent. That's how he's been able to cover up what happened to Margaret and Diana." Ryan felt the walls closing in around them, but his Coast Guard training had taught him that panic was a luxury he couldn't afford. If the local authorities were compromised, they needed to find another way out, and they needed to do it before those sirens reached the mansion. "The federal agents," Ryan said suddenly, remembering something Caroline had mentioned earlier. "You said your grandmother's trust fund was worth $500 million. That kind of money doesn't just disappear without federal oversight." There have to be IRS agents, FBI financial crimes investigators, someone who's been watching those accounts. The trust is managed through a bank in Boston, Caroline said, hope flickering in her eyes. Grandfather always complained about federal auditors asking questions about large transfers and inheritance distributions. He's been having to provide documentation to satisfy federal requirements. Which means there are people in Boston who will be very interested to know that the beneficiary of a $500 million trust fund is being coerced into marriage and murder, Ryan said grimly. People who don't take orders from Theodore Ashford. The sirens were almost at the mansion now, and Ryan could hear vehicles pulling into the circular driveway below. Time was running out, but he wasn't ready to surrender Caroline to her grandfather's mercies or trust their lives to a police force that might be working for their enemies. Is there another way out of this room? Ryan asked urgently. A back door? A window? Anything? Caroline shook her head. The study only has one entrance, and the windows are 3 stories above the ground with no fire escape on this side of the building. Then we go up instead of down, Ryan said, looking at the ceiling of the vault. Old houses like this always have servant passages and maintenance tunnels between the floors. If we can get into the walls, we might be able to reach a different part of the house. The servants' passages were sealed up decades ago, Caroline said. Grandfather had them blocked off when he renovated the mansion in the 1980s. He said they were security risks. Ryan was about to respond when he heard Theodore Ashford's voice outside the vault, speaking to someone who had apparently just arrived. Chief Morrison, thank you for responding so quickly, Ashford was saying. I'm afraid we have a situation here. My granddaughter Caroline has been kidnapped by a mentally unstable individual who has forced his way into my home and is holding her hostage in my private study. Where are they now, Mr. Ashford? Came a gravelly voice that Ryan assumed belonged to the police chief. Barricaded in my personal vault, Ashford replied. The man has been making threats against Caroline's life, and I'm afraid he may be armed and dangerous. I have reason to believe he's the same individual who has been stalking her for weeks, making unwanted advances, and becoming increasingly erratic when she rejected him. The lies rolled off Theodore Ashford's tongue with practiced ease, creating a narrative that would justify anything the police might do to rescue Caroline from her supposed kidnapper. Ryan realized that they had walked directly into a trap that had been set long before they ever entered the mansion. Mr. Torres, Chief Morrison called out, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to having his orders obeyed. This is Chief Morrison of the Millbrook Harbor Police. I need you to come out of that vault with your hands visible and no sudden movements. If you cooperate, we can resolve this situation peacefully. Chief Morrison, Ryan called back. Caroline Ashford is here of her own free will, and we have evidence that her grandfather has been systematically murdering members of his own family for their inheritance money. You need to call the FBI and the State Attorney General's office before anyone else gets hurt. There was a long pause, followed by whispered conversations that Ryan couldn't make out. When Chief Morrison spoke again, his tone had shifted from authoritative to patronizing. Mr. Torres, I understand you've been under a lot of stress since your wife's death. Single parenthood is difficult, and financial pressures can make people do things they wouldn't normally consider. But this isn't the way to solve your problems. Come out now, and we can get you the help you need. The psychological manipulation was masterful. Chief Morrison was painting Ryan as a grief-stricken widower who had snapped under pressure, creating a narrative that would discredit anything he might say about Theodore Ashford's crimes. It was exactly the kind of strategy that corrupt officials use to protect their benefactors while destroying their accusers. Caroline, Ryan said quietly, is there any way to contact federal authorities directly, someone who would have jurisdiction over your trust fund? Caroline pulled out her phone and scrolled through her contacts. I have the number for the trust administrator at First National Bank of Boston. She's been handling the federal compliance paperwork for years, and she's asked me several times about unusual withdrawal patterns and transfer requests. Call her, Ryan said urgently. Tell her that you're being coerced into marriage to facilitate illegal access to your inheritance, and that you have documentary evidence of related murders. Tell her that local law enforcement is compromised, and that you need immediate federal intervention. Caroline's hands shook as she dialed the number, but her voice was steady when someone answered. Miss Patterson, this is Caroline Ashford. I need to report a federal crime involving my grandmother's trust fund. Yes, I know it's unusual to call on a Saturday, but people are trying to kill me to get access to the money. I have physical evidence, including a signed confession. No, I can't come to your office. I'm being held by corrupted local police who are working with the criminals. While Caroline explained their situation to the trust administrator, Ryan could hear activity escalating outside the vault. More vehicles were arriving, and he could distinguish at least 6 different voices now, far more people than would be needed for a simple hostage situation. They're setting up a perimeter, one of the new arrivals was saying. Full tactical response, just like we discussed. No survivors, no witnesses, nothing that can be traced back to the family. Ryan felt his blood turn to ice. These weren't police officers responding to a hostage situation. They were executioners preparing to eliminate the people who had discovered Theodore Ashford's secrets. The badges and uniforms were just camouflage for what amounted to a private army. Miss Patterson says she's contacting the FBI immediately, Carolyn whispered, hanging up her phone. She's also calling the IRS Criminal Investigation Division and the Massachusetts Attorney General's office. She says that what I've described constitutes multiple federal crimes, and that they'll have to respond regardless of local political considerations. How long before they get here? She said 2 hours minimum, possibly 4 depending on how quickly they can mobilize resources on a Saturday. 2 to 4 hours. Ryan looked around the vault, calculating their resources and options. They had enough air to last that long, assuming the ventilation system wasn't compromised. They had evidence that could destroy Theodore Ashford and his network of accomplices. And they had the element of surprise. Their enemies thought they were dealing with a desperate amateur, not someone who had spent years training for exactly these kinds of high-stakes survival situations. Caroline, Ryan said quietly, I need you to tell me everything you know about the construction of this vault. How thick are the walls? What's behind them? Is there any way someone could cut through from the outside? The walls are reinforced steel, about 6 inches thick, Caroline replied. Behind them is the original stone wall of the mansion, then empty space where the old servants' passages used to be, then the wall of the next room. Grandfather designed it to be impregnable. He used to joke that it could survive a direct hit from a cannon. What about the floor? Steel reinforcement over the original wooden floor beams. But, Caroline paused, a memory seeming to surface. When I was little, I used to play in the vault sometimes when Grandfather was traveling. I remember hearing sounds from below, voices, footsteps, mechanical noises. I always assumed it was just the house settling, but now I wonder if there might be some kind of basement room directly underneath us. Ryan knelt down and pressed his ear to the floor, listening intently. After a moment, he could hear it, the faint sound of voices and movement coming from somewhere below the vault. But these weren't the voices of Theodore Ashford's men. They were different, unfamiliar, and they seemed to be having their own urgent conversation. There's definitely someone down there, Ryan whispered, and they don't sound like they're part of Ashford's team. Mr. Torres, Chief Morrison called out again, his voice now carrying a harder edge. You have 60 seconds to come out of that vault, or we're going to have to take more aggressive action. I have reports that you're armed and have made threats against Miss Ashford's life. Don't make this harder than it has to be. Ryan looked at Caroline, seeing his own determination reflected in her eyes. They had come too far to surrender now, and they both knew that walking out of the vault would be signing their own death warrants. Chief Morrison, Ryan called back, before you do anything you'll regret, you should know that federal authorities are already on their way. The FBI, IRS, and State Attorney General's office have all been notified about the evidence we've found. If anything happens to us, there are going to be a lot of uncomfortable questions about why local law enforcement was so eager to silence the witnesses. The silence that followed this announcement was telling. Ryan could hear urgent whispered conversations, cell phone calls being made, and what sounded like people arguing about how to proceed. His bluff about federal authorities was actually true now, thanks to Caroline's call to the trust administrator, and it was clearly complicating their enemy's plans. There's something else you should consider, Caroline called out, her voice gaining strength as she realized the power she now held. Everything we found in Grandfather's vault has already been photographed and uploaded to secure servers. Even if you kill us, the evidence will still exist, and federal investigators will know exactly who was responsible for our deaths. This was also a bluff. They hadn't had time to photograph or upload anything, but it was a convincing one. Theodore Ashford's entire strategy depended on keeping his crime secret, and the possibility that evidence might survive their deaths would be terrifying to him. "You're lying," Ashford's voice came through the vault door, but there was uncertainty in his tone. "Am I?" Caroline replied. "Grandfather, you taught me to always have contingency plans. Did you really think I wouldn't learn that lesson?" The confession letter about Diana's murder is already in the hands of people who have no connection to Millbrook Harbor and no reason to protect the Ashford family interests. Ryan heard footsteps moving away from the vault door, followed by more urgent conversations. Their enemies were clearly regrouping, trying to figure out how to proceed when their original plan had been compromised. But Ryan knew that desperate people with everything to lose were the most dangerous kind of enemies. Theodore Ashford and his accomplices weren't going to just walk away because federal authorities might be coming. They were going to escalate, and when they did, the vault that was currently protecting Ryan and Caroline might become their tomb. The sound from below was getting louder now, and Ryan realized that whoever was down there was moving closer to their position. He pressed his ear to the floor again, trying to make out what the voices were saying. "Explosive charges should be sufficient to breach the floor. Make sure the shaped charges are positioned to direct the blast upward. Want this to look like an accident, not a military operation." Ryan's blood turned to ice as he realized what he was hearing. The people below weren't random basement occupants. They were demolition experts, preparing to blast through the vault floor from underneath. Theodore Ashford had called in professionals to eliminate the witnesses and destroy the evidence, and they were planning to do it in a way that would leave no trace of murder. "Caroline," Ryan whispered urgently, "we need to get out of here right now. They're going to blow up the vault floor." Caroline's eyes widened with terror as she understood the implications. "But there's nowhere to go. The door is the only way out, and they're waiting for us." Ryan looked around the vault desperately, his mind racing through possibilities. They were trapped between enemies outside the door and explosives below the floor, with no apparent means of escape. But his Coast Guard training had taught him that there was always a solution. Sometimes you just had to be creative enough to find it. "The ventilation system," he said suddenly, looking up at the small grate near the ceiling of the vault. "How does air get in and out of this room?" "There's a small air shaft that connects to the mansion's main HVAC system," Caroline said, following his gaze. "But it's barely big enough for a person to crawl through, and it's 30 feet above the ground on the outside of the building." "30 feet is nothing compared to being blown up," Ryan replied grimly, "and I've rappelled down helicopter rescue lines that were a lot longer than that." The sound of drilling was coming from below now, and Ryan could see dust beginning to fall from the vault floor as the demolition team prepared their charges. They had minutes at most before the explosion would tear through the steel reinforcement and kill anyone still inside the vault. "Help me move this shelf," Ryan said, pointing to a heavy bookcase that was positioned below the ventilation grate. "If we can stack enough furniture, we might be able to reach the air shaft." As they worked frantically to build an improvised ladder, Ryan could hear Theodore Ashford giving orders outside the vault door. "Make sure the blast is contained," Ashford was saying. "I want it to look like a gas explosion, something that could have happened accidentally during the renovation work. And I want every piece of evidence destroyed. Nothing can survive to contradict our version of events." "What about the bodies?" someone asked. "Tragic accident," Ashford replied coldly. "Unstable widower takes hostage, accidentally triggers gas explosion during standoff with police. Local hero police chief dies trying to save them. The whole town will mourn, and no one will ask uncomfortable questions about what really happened." Ryan felt a surge of rage at Theodore Ashford's casual planning of mass murder, but he channeled that anger into focus. They were almost to the ventilation grate now, and he could see that the air shaft extended horizontally for several feet before angling upward toward the outside of the building. "Can you fit through there?" he asked Caroline. "I think so," she replied, though her voice was shaky with fear. "But what about you?" "I'll be right behind you," Ryan promised. "But you go first. If something happens to me, you keep going and get that evidence to the federal authorities." Caroline clutched the leather portfolio containing her grandfather's confession and climbed toward the ventilation grate. Ryan could hear the drilling sounds getting more intense below, and he knew they were running out of time. As Caroline disappeared into the air shaft, Ryan took one last look around the vault that had nearly become their tomb. Theodore Ashford thought he had won, thought he had eliminated the witnesses and destroyed the evidence that could bring down his empire. He was about to discover just how wrong he was. The explosion came just as Ryan pulled himself into the airshaft, the blast wave pushing him forward through the narrow tunnel as debris and flame erupted behind him. The vault floor had been completely destroyed, along with any evidence that might have been left behind. But the most important evidence was already crawling through the mansion's ventilation system, carried by two people who had just declared war on one of the most powerful criminal organizations in New England. The real battle was just beginning. The air shaft was a claustrophobic nightmare of sharp metal edges and accumulated dust that made every breath feel like sandpaper against Ryan's lungs. He could hear Caroline ahead of him, her movements growing more frantic as the sound of the explosion echoed through the mansion's ventilation system behind them. The blast had been contained enough to avoid bringing down the entire building, but Ryan could smell smoke and hear the distant sound of alarms as Theodore Ashford's carefully orchestrated gas explosion began to unfold. "There's light ahead," Caroline called back to him, her voice muffled by the narrow confines of the shaft. "I think we're almost to an exterior vent." Ryan forced himself to keep moving, despite the burning sensation in his chest and the way the metal walls seemed to be closing in around him. His Coast Guard training had included confined space rescue operations, but those had always been temporary situations with backup support standing by. This was different. They were completely on their own, crawling through a mechanical maze while their enemies controlled everything outside. The air shaft took a sharp turn upward, and Ryan could see natural light filtering down from above. Caroline was already climbing toward it, her movements becoming more confident, as escape seemed within reach. But Ryan's military experience had taught him to be suspicious of anything that seemed too easy, and the fact that they'd managed to reach an exit so quickly after the explosion felt like a trap waiting to spring. "Caroline, wait," he called out softly. "Before you go through that vent, we need to figure out where it leads and who might be watching it." She paused in her climbing, looking back at him with eyes that were wide with fear and exhaustion. "I can see trees and sky. It looks like we're on the side of the mansion that faces away from the main driveway. If we can get down to the ground, we might be able to reach the woods without being seen." "Huh, and then what?" Ryan asked. "Your grandfather owns this entire area, and his people will be watching every road out of town. We can't just run and hope they don't catch us." Caroline's face crumpled as the reality of their situation hit her. "Then what do? We can't stay in here forever. And they'll search every inch of the mansion once they realize we weren't killed in the explosion." Ryan was quiet for a moment, his mind working through possibilities and contingencies. They had the evidence they needed to destroy Theodore Ashford, but only if they could get it to people who weren't already corrupted by his influence. The federal authorities Caroline had contacted would eventually arrive, but probably not before Ashford's people had time to track them down and eliminate them. "We need to buy time," Ryan said finally, "long enough for the FBI to get here, and long enough to make sure the evidence gets to people who can act on it. But we can't do that by running. We'll have to fight." "Fight?" Caroline looked at him as if he'd suggested they sprout wings and fly away. "Ryan, these people have guns. They have trained killers. They have resources we can't even imagine. How are we supposed to fight them?" Ryan thought about his daughter Lily, probably sitting at Henderson Hardware right now, playing with the toys Pete kept behind the counter while she waited for her father to come pick her up. He thought about the promise he'd made to Emma on her deathbed, that he would always protect their little girl and teach her that good people stood up to bullies no matter how powerful they were. "We fight them the way David fought Goliath," Ryan said grimly. "We find their weakness and we hit it hard before they know what happened." "What weakness?" "Theodore Ashford has been building his empire for 50 years. He's anticipated every possible threat, bought off every potential enemy, eliminated every person who could expose him. Except us," Ryan pointed out. "We're still alive, we still have the evidence, and we know things about his operation that he doesn't think we know. Plus, he's made one critical mistake that's going to cost him everything." "What mistake?" Ryan smiled for the first time since they'd entered the mansion. "He threatened my daughter. And that means he's not just fighting me anymore. He's fighting everyone in this town who cares about protecting children from monsters." Caroline looked confused, but Ryan was already moving again, climbing toward the exterior vent with a sense of purpose that had been missing since the explosion. He had a plan now, dangerous and desperate, but with a real chance of success if they could execute it properly. The vent cover opened easily, revealing a drop of about 15 feet to a narrow ledge that ran along the side of the mansion. Below that was another 20-foot drop to the landscaped grounds, but Ryan could see thick bushes that would break their fall if they landed correctly. "I'm going first," Ryan said, positioning himself at the opening. "Count to 30, then follow me. If something goes wrong and I'm captured, you keep going and get that evidence to the federal agents." "Ryan, wait!" But he was already gone, dropping through the opening and landing hard on the ledge below. His ankle twisted on impact, sending a spike of pain up his leg, but nothing seemed to be broken. He looked up at the vent and motioned for Carolyn to follow, scanning the grounds around them for any sign of watchers. Caroline landed beside him a moment later, clutching the leather portfolio against her chest like a shield. "Now what?" she whispered. "Now we go to war," Ryan replied, pointing toward a section of the grounds where he could see a maintenance shed partially hidden by trees. "But first, we need to make a phone call." They made their way carefully along the ledge, then dropped down to the bushes below. Ryan's ankle protested every step, but adrenaline was keeping the worst of the pain at bay. The maintenance shed was unlocked, filled with gardening equipment and machinery that looked like it hadn't been used in years. Ryan pulled out his phone and dialed a number he knew by heart. "Henderson Hardware, this is Pete." "Pete, it's Ryan. Is Lily still with you?" "Safe and sound, just like you asked. She's in the back room coloring pictures and asking when Daddy's coming home." "Ryan, what the hell is going on?" "There are reports on the radio about an explosion at the Ashford mansion and some kind of police standoff." "Pete, I need you to listen very carefully. In about 10 minutes, I'm going to need you to make some phone calls for me. I'm going to give you a list of numbers, and I need you to tell everyone the same thing. Theodore Ashford has been murdering his own family members for their inheritance money, and he's planning to kill a 7-year-old girl to cover it up." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Jesus Christ, Ryan, are you serious?" "Dead serious. And Pete, I need you to tell everyone that this isn't just about me and my family anymore. If Ashford gets away with this, no child in Millbrook Harbor will ever be safe from him again." Ryan could hear Pete breathing heavily, processing the implications of what he was being asked to do. "Give me the numbers," Pete said finally. "And Ryan, you be careful out there. That little girl needs her daddy to come home." Ryan rattled off phone numbers from memory. Teachers from Lily's school, parents from her soccer team, coaches from the youth league, neighbors who had known the Torres family since before Emma died. People who might not have the power to stand up to Theodore Ashford individually, but who together represented something that money couldn't buy, a community that protected its own. "Tell them to meet at the school," Ryan said. "Tell them to bring cameras, bring their phones, bring anything that can record what happens next. And Pete, tell them that if they want their children to grow up in a town where rich men can't murder people with impunity, they need to be there in 1 hour." "What are you planning to do, Ryan?" "I'm planning to give Theodore Ashford exactly what he's been asking for," Ryan replied grimly. "A public confrontation where everyone can see what kind of man he really is." After he hung up, Caroline stared at him with a mixture of admiration and terror. "You're going to turn this into a media circus. Force grandfather to face the community he's been manipulating for decades." "I'm going to turn this into a reckoning," Ryan corrected. "Your grandfather has spent 50 years hiding behind money and influence, having other people do his dirty work while he played the role of respected businessman. But when push comes to shove, bullies are always cowards, and cowards make mistakes when they're forced to act in the open. But what if he doesn't make mistakes? What if he just has us killed in front of everyone and claims it was self-defense?" Ryan pulled the small digital recorder from his pocket, the one they'd taken from Theodore Ashford's vault before the explosion. "Then we make sure his confession is playing loud enough for everyone to hear when he does it." Caroline's eyes widened as she realized what Ryan was suggesting. "You want to broadcast grandfather's confession about Diana's murder in front of the entire town." "I want to broadcast it in front of everyone he's been lying to for decades. Teachers whose schools he's donated to, parents whose children play in parks he's funded, business owners who depend on his contracts. I want them all to hear Theodore Ashford describe in his own words how he murdered a 28-year-old woman for her inheritance money. The plan was audacious to the point of being suicidal, but Ryan could see that Caroline was beginning to understand its brilliance. Theodore Ashford's power depended on maintaining his reputation as a pillar of the community. If that reputation was destroyed publicly, in front of hundreds of witnesses with cameras and recording devices, even his corrupted allies in law enforcement wouldn't be able to protect him. "There's just one problem," Caroline said quietly. "How do we get from here to the school without being captured? Grandfather's people will be watching every road, every path, every possible route we might take." Ryan smiled and pointed to a rusty bicycle that was leaning against the wall of the maintenance shed. "We don't take the roads. We take the old logging trail that runs behind the school. I used to ride that path when I was a kid, and it connects to the drainage system that runs under the town. If we can get to the storm drains, we can move underground until we're directly beneath the school playground." "That's insane," Caroline said. "The drainage tunnels haven't been maintained in years. They could be flooded, collapsed, filled with debris." "Or they could be our salvation," Ryan replied, checking his watch. "Caroline, in 45 minutes, every parent in Millbrook Harbor is going to be at that school, waiting to hear why Theodore Ashford thinks it's acceptable to threaten children. We can either be there to tell them the truth, or we can be dead in some ditch while your grandfather spins whatever story he wants about what happened here today." Caroline looked at the bicycle, then at the leather portfolio containing the evidence that could bring down her grandfather's empire. "If we do this, there's no going back. Even if we survive, everything changes. My life, your life, this entire town. Everything changed the moment your grandfather decided that murdering young women was an acceptable business strategy," Ryan said firmly. "We're not changing anything. We're just making sure everyone else knows what's already been happening." Caroline nodded slowly, her fear giving way to the same determined resolve that had carried her through 25 years of psychological abuse. "Then let's go to war." They left the maintenance shed together, Caroline riding on the handlebars of the ancient bicycle, while Ryan pedaled toward the tree line that marked the beginning of the old logging trail. Behind them, the Ashford mansion was still burning, smoke rising into the afternoon sky like a signal fire, announcing that the age of Theodore Ashford's unchallenged power was finally coming to an end. As they disappeared into the woods, Ryan's phone buzzed with a text message from Pete Henderson. "Calls made. Word is spreading. Half the town is already heading to the school. Whatever you're planning, make it count." Ryan deleted the message and pedaled harder, racing against time and Theodore Ashford's network of killers toward a confrontation that would determine not just their own survival, but the future of everyone who had ever called Millbrook Harbor home. The logging trail was rougher than Ryan remembered, overgrown with brambles and littered with fallen branches that made navigation treacherous. But it was also hidden from the roads where Ashford's people would be searching, and it led directly to the storm drain system that could get them to the school undetected. As they bounced along the uneven path, Caroline clutched the evidence that would either save them or get them killed, while Ryan focused on the simple task of staying upright and moving forward. Behind them, the sound of sirens was growing louder as more emergency vehicles responded to the explosion at the mansion. But ahead of them lay something that Theodore Ashford had never anticipated in 50 years of careful planning, an entire community of people who were about to learn that their most respected citizen was actually their most dangerous enemy. The war for Millbrook Harbor was about to begin. 88. The storm drain beneath Millbrook Harbor was a forgotten relic from the town's industrial past, a network of concrete tunnels wide enough for maintenance crews but narrow enough to feel like a tomb. Ryan's phone flashlight cut through the darkness as he and Caroline made their way through knee-deep water that smelled of decades of accumulated debris and neglect. "The school should be directly above us in about 200 yards, Ryan whispered, his voice echoing off the curved walls. The sound of their movement through the murky water seemed impossibly loud in the confined space, and he found himself listening constantly for any indication that they were being followed. Caroline was struggling to keep the leather portfolio dry, holding it above her head as they waded through sections where the water rose almost to their waists. "How can you be sure we're going in the right direction? These tunnels all look the same." Ryan paused at a junction where 3 passages met, studying the faded markings on the concrete walls. "Coast Guard navigation training," he said, pointing to a series of numbers and arrows that were barely visible beneath layers of grime. Every infrastructure system has markers if you know how to read them. This way. As they continued through the labyrinth, Ryan's mind was working through the logistics of what they were about to attempt. By now, Pete Henderson would have made his calls, and word would be spreading through Millbrook Harbor's tight-knit community, like wildfire. Parents would be pulling up to the elementary school, teachers would be leaving their Saturday afternoon activities, and local business owners would be closing their shops to see what Ryan Torres had to say about Theodore Ashford. But Theodore Ashford wouldn't be sitting idle either. He would have realized by now that the explosion hadn't killed them, and he would be mobilizing every resource at his disposal to find them before they could reach the school. Corrupt police officers, private security teams, and probably federal agents who were actually working for his organization rather than against it. "Ryan," Caroline said suddenly, her voice tight with fear, "what if Pete couldn't reach enough people? What if only a few parents show up and grandfather's people outnumber them?" "Then we improvise," Ryan replied grimly. "But Caroline, you need to understand something about small towns like this one. When word spreads that someone is threatening children, people don't just show up, they show up angry. And angry parents are a force that even Theodore Ashford has never had to deal with." They were climbing now, following a maintenance ladder that led to a storm grate directly beneath the school playground. Ryan could hear voices above them. Lots of voices, growing louder as more people arrived. His gambit was working. The community was responding to the call for help. "Before we go up there," Caroline said, stopping on the ladder below him, "I need you to know something. If this goes wrong, if grandfather manages to spin this as some kind of kidnapping or terrorism, I don't want you to try to protect me. You have a daughter who needs you alive." Ryan looked down at her, seeing Emma's fierce protectiveness reflected in Caroline's eyes. "Caroline, I didn't save you from that parking lot to abandon you now. We're in this together, and we're getting out of it together. But if you have to choose—" "I won't have to choose," Ryan interrupted. "Because we're not just fighting for ourselves anymore. We're fighting for every person in this town who trusted Theodore Ashford, every family who thought their children were safe because a rich philanthropist was watching over the community. When they hear what he's really been doing, they'll protect us, because protecting us means protecting themselves." Ryan pushed open the storm grate and pulled himself up onto the playground, immediately struck by the sight that greeted him. The school parking lot was packed with cars, trucks, and SUVs, and more were arriving every minute. Parents stood in clusters near the main entrance, their faces showing the kind of worried determination that came when someone threatened what they loved most. He helped Caroline climb out of the storm drain, both of them muddy and soaked but still clutching the evidence that could bring down Theodore Ashford's empire. The late afternoon sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the playground where Lily had played just that morning, completely unaware that her world was about to change forever. "Mr. Torres!" Ryan turned to see Sarah Mitchell, one of Lily's teachers, approaching them with a mixture of relief and concern. Behind her were at least 50 other people, parents he recognized from school events, neighbors from around town, business owners he'd dealt with at Henderson Hardware. "Thank God you're all right," Sarah said. "Pete Henderson called everyone he could think of, and word spread from there. He said Theodore Ashford was threatening to hurt Lily, and that you had evidence of some kind of conspiracy." "More than a conspiracy," Ryan said, his voice carrying clearly across the gathering crowd. "Theodore Ashford has been systematically murdering members of his own family for their inheritance money, and he's been using his influence in this town to cover it up for decades." A murmur ran through the crowd, voices rising in disbelief and anger. These were people who had seen Ashford's name on hospital wings and library buildings, who had attended charity events where he played the role of benevolent patriarch. The idea that their most respected citizen was actually a serial killer was almost impossible to process. "That's a serious accusation, Ryan," said Tom Bradley, the owner of Bradley's Marina where Ryan had worked his evening job. "Do you have proof?" Carolyn stepped forward, still clutching the leather portfolio. "I'm Caroline Ashford, Theodore's granddaughter, and yes, we have proof." Her voice was shaking, but it carried clearly across the crowd. "We have his signed confession to murdering my cousin Diana, financial records showing payments to coroners and police officers, and evidence that he's been planning to kill me for my inheritance." The crowd's murmur turned into something darker, more dangerous. Ryan could see the moment when disbelief turned into understanding. when the pieces began falling into place for people who had always wondered why certain investigations had been dropped, why certain deaths had been ruled accidental, why Theodore Ashford always seemed to benefit when tragedy struck his family. "We also have this," Ryan said, pulling out the digital recorder, Theodore Ashford's own words, describing how he killed Diana and explaining his plans for Caroline. But before he could activate the recording, the sound of approaching vehicles cut through the evening air. Black SUVs were pulling into the school parking lot, their tinted windows and aggressive positioning immediately identifying them as hostile forces rather than additional community members. "Get behind the cars," Ryan shouted, his Coast Guard training taking over as he recognized the tactical formation of the approaching vehicles. "Everyone with children, get them away from the open areas." The SUVs disgorged men in tactical gear, not quite military uniforms, but clearly professional operators who were trained for exactly this kind of situation. Ryan counted at least 12 of them, all armed, all moving with the coordinated precision of a team that had worked together before. Leading them was Theodore Ashford himself, immaculate in an expensive suit despite the chaos of the afternoon, walking across the school parking lot like he owned not just the ground beneath his feet, but the very air around him. His presence transformed the gathering from a community meeting into something that felt much more dangerous. "Ladies and gentlemen," Ashford called out, his cultured voice carrying easily across the crowd, "I apologize for this disruption to your Saturday evening. I'm here to collect my granddaughter, who has been kidnapped by a mentally unstable individual who has been making threats against my family." "That's a lie!" Caroline shouted, stepping out from behind one of the parked cars. "Grandfather, tell them about Diana. Tell them about Margaret. Tell them about the confession you wrote describing how you murdered your own granddaughter." Theodore Ashford's expression didn't change, but Ryan caught a flicker of something, surprise perhaps or calculation, in the old man's eyes. He hadn't expected Caroline to confront him publicly, hadn't anticipated that she would find the courage to expose him in front of the entire community. "Caroline, dear," Ashford said, his voice taking on the patronizing tone of someone addressing a confused child, "you've been through a terrible ordeal. This man has clearly filled your head with fantasies and delusions. Come with me now, and we can get you the help you need." "The help she needs is protection from you," Ryan said, stepping forward to stand beside Caroline, "and everyone here is about to understand why." He activated the digital recorder, and Theodore Ashford's voice began to play across the school parking lot, describing Diana's murder in clinical detail. The words carried clearly in the evening air, and Ryan watched as the faces in the crowd changed from confusion to horror to rage. "I, Theodore Ashford, being of sound mind and under no external coercion, do hereby confess to the premeditated murder of my granddaughter Diana Elizabeth Ashford, carried out through the systematic administration of thallium sulfate over a period of 6 weeks." The recording continued, describing forged medical records, bribed coroners, and the careful planning that had made Diana's death look like the result of alcoholism rather than poison. But what made the crowd's anger palpable was the casual tone in Ashford's voice, the complete lack of remorse or human emotion as he described destroying a young woman's life for money. "Turn that off," Ashford commanded, his composure finally cracking as he realized the full scope of what Ryan and Caroline had discovered. That recording was obtained illegally, and it's been taken completely out of context. "What context makes it acceptable to murder your own granddaughter?" shouted Maria Santos, whose daughter was in Lily's class. "What context makes it okay to threaten children to cover up your crimes?" The crowd was moving now, pressing closer to Theodore Ashford and his security team, their fear giving way to the kind of protective fury that came when people realized their families had been threatened. These weren't protesters or activists. These were parents and neighbors and community members who had just learned that someone they had trusted and respected was actually a monster. "Everyone stay back," one of Ashford's security personnel called out, his hand moving toward his weapon. "This is a private family matter, and we're authorized to use force to protect Mr. Ashford." "Authorized by who?" demanded Chief Morrison, who had just arrived with several police cars. But instead of the corrupt official Ryan had expected, Morrison looked genuinely confused and increasingly angry as he processed what he was hearing. "Theodore, what the hell is going on here? That recording, is that really your voice?" Ryan realized that Theodore Ashford's network of corruption might not be as complete as they had assumed. Chief Morrison might be influenced by Ashford money, But he was also a local man with local loyalties, and hearing a confession to child murder was apparently enough to override whatever financial arrangements might have existed. "Jim, you know me," Ashford said, appealing directly to the police chief. "This is clearly some kind of elaborate hoax, probably involving sophisticated audio manipulation. I'm the victim here, not the perpetrator." But Chief Morrison was looking at Caroline now, seeing the terror and determination in her eyes, and Ryan could tell that the police chief was beginning to understand that he had been played for years by a man who had been using him to cover up serial murder. "Caroline," Morrison said quietly, "is that recording real? Did your grandfather really confess to killing Diana?" "It's real," Caroline said, her voice steady despite the chaos around them. "And he killed Margaret too. And he was planning to kill me after forcing me to marry Jeremy Blackstone. Chief Morrison, my grandfather has been using his influence in this town to commit murder for decades, and he's been counting on people like you to help him cover it up." The police chief looked like he had been physically struck. Ryan could see the moment when Morrison realized that he had been complicit in multiple murders, that his willingness to overlook certain investigations and accept certain explanations had made him an accessory to Theodore Ashford's crimes. "Jim," Ashford said urgently, sensing that his control over the situation was slipping away, "you've known me for 20 years. You know what kind of man I am. Are you really going to take the word of a kidnapper and his victim over mine?" Chief Morrison looked around at the crowd of parents and community members, all of whom were staring at him with expressions that demanded justice rather than continued corruption. These were his neighbors, his friends, people whose children went to school with his own grandchildren. The choice between Theodore Ashford's money and his community's trust was suddenly very clear. "Theodore Ashford," Chief Morrison said, his voice carrying the weight of years of suppressed doubts finally being acknowledged, "you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, accessory to murder, and about a dozen other charges that I'm going to figure out once we get you back to the station." The crowd erupted in cheers and applause, but Ryan knew that their victory was far from complete. Theodore Ashford still had resources, still had connections, and he still had a team of armed security personnel who might not be willing to accept their employer's arrest without a fight. "This isn't over," Ashford said quietly, his words directed at Ryan and Caroline even as Chief Morrison began reading him his rights. "You have no idea what forces you've set in motion, what people you've made enemies of. This goes far beyond Millbrook Harbor, and there are those who won't allow their interests to be compromised by your heroics." Ryan met the old man's gaze steadily, thinking about Lily and Emma and every person in this crowd who had trusted that their community leaders would protect them rather than prey upon them. "Maybe not," Ryan replied, "but it's a start." As Theodore Ashford was led away in handcuffs, Ryan realized that their real work was just beginning. They had won the battle, but the war for justice would require exposing every person who had helped Ashford commit his crimes, every official who had been corrupted, every system that had been compromised. The sun was setting over Millbrook Harbor, but for the first time in decades, its people could sleep knowing that their children were a little bit safer than they had been that morning. The Millbrook Harbor police station had never seen anything like the chaos that erupted in the hours following Theodore Ashford's arrest. What had started as a simple booking procedure quickly escalated into a federal investigation as agents from the FBI, IRS Criminal Investigation Division, and Massachusetts Attorney General's office descended on the small coastal town like a swarm of purposeful locusts. Ryan sat in Chief Morrison's office, still wearing his muddy clothes from the storm drain adventure, watching through the window as news vans began arriving in the station parking lot. Caroline was in the adjacent conference room being interviewed by Agent Patricia Wells from the FBI's Boston field office, the leather portfolio containing Theodore Ashford's confessions spread across the table like pieces of a jigsaw puzzle that was finally coming together. "Mr. Torres," Agent Wells said, entering the office with a thick file folder and an expression that suggested she'd been working organized crime cases long enough to be surprised by very little, "I need to thank you. We've been investigating irregularities in the Ashford shipping empire for 3 years, but we never had the evidence to move forward. What you and Miss Ashford recovered today gives us everything we need to bring down not just Theodore Ashford, but an entire network of corrupt officials and business associates." Ryan looked up from the cup of coffee that someone had pressed into his hands. "How big is this network?" "Bigger than we initially suspected," Agent Wells replied grimly. The financial records you found reference payments to officials in 6 different states, federal maritime inspectors, customs agents, and what appears to be a systematic bribery operation that's been running for at least 15 years. Theodore Ashford wasn't just killing family members for inheritance money. He was using that money to build a criminal empire that touched everything from drug smuggling to human trafficking. The scope of what they had uncovered was staggering. Ryan had thought they were dealing with a single corrupt businessman, but apparently Theodore Ashford had been operating as the head of a criminal organization that made the traditional mob look like amateur hour. What about the local officials? Ryan asked, thinking about Chief Morrison's obvious shock when he'd heard the confession recording. How many people in town were actively helping him? That's still being determined, Agent Wells said. Chief Morrison appears to have been manipulated rather than corrupted, influenced to overlook certain investigations without being told why. The mayor and several town council members, however, received substantial campaign contributions and consulting fees from Ashford-controlled companies. We're going to have to assume that the entire local power structure has been compromised. Through the office window, Ryan could see Pete Henderson arriving with Lily, who had insisted on coming to the police station when she heard that her daddy was involved in something important. She was walking between Pete and Mrs. Patterson, her 7-year-old face serious in the way that children get when they sense that the adults around them are dealing with something significant. I need to see my daughter, Ryan said, standing up from the chair where he'd been sitting for the past 2 hours. Of course, Agent Wells replied. But Mr. Torres, there's something else we need to discuss. Theodore Ashford's arrest is going to create a power vacuum in a criminal organization that spans multiple states and involves millions of dollars in illegal activity. His associates aren't going to just disappear. They're going to try to protect their interests, and that may include eliminating the witnesses who brought down their operation. Ryan felt his blood run cold. You're saying Caroline and I are still in danger? I'm saying that you and your daughter and anyone else who helped expose this conspiracy are going to need federal protection until we can roll up the entire network. These people have killed before, and they won't hesitate to kill again if they think it will protect their operations. The door opened and Lily burst in, throwing herself into Ryan's arms with the fierce intensity of a child who had been scared that something terrible might happen to her father. Ryan held her close, breathing in the familiar scent of her shampoo and feeling the solid reality of her small body against his chest. Daddy, Mr. Pete said you were helping catch bad guys, Lily said, pulling back to look at his face with serious brown eyes that reminded him so much of Emma it made his chest ache. Are you okay? You look all dirty and tired. I'm fine, sweetheart, Ryan said, smoothing her hair back from her forehead. I had to do some things today to make sure you and all the other kids in town stay safe. From the bad guys? From the bad guys, Ryan confirmed, but it's over now. The police caught them, and they can't hurt anyone anymore. Even as he said the words, Ryan knew they weren't entirely true. Theodore Ashford was in custody, but his criminal network was still out there. And Agent Wells was right that they would be seeking revenge against the people who had exposed them. The immediate danger might be over, but the larger threat was just beginning. Mr. Torres, Agent Wells said gently, we're going to need to discuss relocation options for you and Lily, at least temporarily, until we can ensure your safety. Relocation? Lily looked back and forth between Ryan and the FBI agent. Does that mean we have to move away from Millbrook Harbor? Ryan's heart broke at the hope in his daughter's voice. Despite everything they'd been through, despite the financial struggles and the cramped apartment, and the constant worry about making ends meet, Millbrook Harbor was home. It was where Emma was buried, where Lily had friends, where Ryan had built a life out of the ruins of his military career. I don't know yet, sweetheart, Ryan said honestly. We might have to go somewhere else for a little while just to be safe. But what about Mrs. Patterson? And Mr. Pete? And my school? Before Ryan could answer, Chief Morrison appeared in the doorway, his face showing the strain of a man who had just discovered that half his career had been built on lies and corruption. Ryan, I need to apologize, Morrison said, his voice heavy with guilt and exhaustion. I should have seen what was happening. I should have asked more questions when certain cases got dropped or when evidence mysteriously disappeared. I let Theodore Ashford manipulate me, and people died because of it. Chief Morrison, Ryan replied, you couldn't have known. Ashford spent decades perfecting his manipulation techniques. He was good at making people see only what he wanted them to see. "That's no excuse," Morrison said firmly. "I'm the chief of police. It was my job to protect this community, and I failed. But I want you to know that's going to change. Whatever federal support you need, whatever resources it takes to keep you and Carolyn safe, this department will provide it." Agent Wells looked up from the files she'd been reviewing. "Chief Morrison, I appreciate the sentiment, but we're going to need to assume that your entire department has been compromised until we can complete a full investigation. Any protection we provide will have to come from federal resources." The implication was clear. The Millbrook Harbor Police Department couldn't be trusted to protect the very people who had exposed the corruption within their own ranks. It was a devastating blow to Morrison's pride, but Ryan could see that the police chief understood the necessity. "There is one thing," Agent Wells continued, "that might allow Mr. Torres and his daughter to remain in Millbrook Harbor while still ensuring their safety." "What's that?" Ryan asked. "We're going to need ongoing cooperation from both you and Miss Ashford as we build cases against Ashford's associates. If you are willing to work with us as protected witnesses, we could establish a federal safe house here in town and provide round-the-clock security while still allowing you to maintain some semblance of normal life." Ryan looked down at Lily, who was listening to the adult conversation with the intense focus that children brought to discussions that might affect their world. He thought about Emma, about the promise he'd made to always put their daughter's needs first, about the life they'd built in this small coastal town despite all its imperfections. "What would that mean exactly?" he asked. "It means federal marshals living in the house next door," Agent Wells explained. "It means security escorts when Lily goes to school, when you go to work, when you go grocery shopping. It means living under protection until we can eliminate the threat completely." For how long? Honestly, could be months, could be years. These kinds of investigations take time, especially when they involve multiple jurisdictions and international components. Lily tugged on Ryan's shirt. "Daddy, what's a federal marshal?" "They're like police officers," Ryan explained, "but they work for the whole country instead of just one town." "Would they be nice?" Ryan looked at Agent Wells, who smiled for the first time since she'd arrived. "We'd make sure they were very nice," she said to Lily. "And they'd be there to keep you and your daddy safe from anyone who might want to hurt you." "Okay," Lily said with the easy acceptance of childhood. "Can we still go to the harbor and look for sea glass?" "You can still do everything you normally do," Agent Wells assured her. "You'll just have some extra protection while you do it." As they continued discussing the logistics of federal protection, Ryan found himself thinking about Caroline, who was facing the same impossible choices but without the anchor of a child to consider. Her entire life had been upended, her family destroyed, her future completely uncertain. At least Ryan had Lily to provide focus and purpose. Caroline would have to rebuild everything from scratch. "What about Caroline?" he asked. "What kind of protection are you offering her?" "Miss Ashford's situation is more complicated," Agent Wells admitted. "She's the primary witness against her grandfather's criminal organization, which makes her a high-value target. She'll need maximum security protection, possibly in a completely different location." "She shouldn't have to face this alone," Ryan said firmly. "She's been isolated her entire life, controlled and manipulated by people who were supposed to protect her. If we're both going into witness protection, we should be able to support each other through it." Agent Wells looked at him with something that might have been approval. "That could be arranged, assuming both parties are agreeable. In fact, it might be beneficial from a security standpoint, easier to protect two witnesses in one location than to maintain separate safe houses." The door opened again, and Caroline appeared with another FBI agent, looking exhausted but somehow lighter than Ryan had ever seen her. The weight of carrying Theodore Ashford's secrets alone had been lifted from her shoulders, and despite the danger they still faced, she seemed to be breathing more freely. "How are you holding up?" Ryan asked. "Better than I expected," Caroline replied. "It's strange. I've been afraid for so long that I'd forgotten what it felt like not to be terrified every moment of every day. Even with everything that's still unknown, even with the danger we're still in, I feel free." Lily looked up at Caroline with the curiosity that children always showed toward new adults in their orbit. "Are you the lady Daddy helped?" "I am," Caroline said, kneeling down to Lily's eye level. "Your daddy is a very brave man. He saved my life." "He's good at helping people," Lily said matter-of-factly. "Mommy used to say that Daddy couldn't help himself. If someone needed help, he just had to give it." Caroline's eyes filled with tears at the simple wisdom of a 7-year-old's observation. Your mommy was right. And because your daddy helped me, a lot of other people are going to be safer now. As Ryan watched his daughter and Caroline talk, he realized that whatever came next, federal protection, extended investigations, the slow process of bringing Theodore Ashford's entire network to justice, they would face it together. They had become a family of sorts, bonded by trauma and survival and the shared knowledge that they had done something important and necessary and dangerous. The war against Theodore Ashford's criminal empire was far from over, but they had won the first battle. And sometimes, in the fight between good and evil, that was enough to build hope upon. Outside the police station, the sun was setting over Millbrook Harbor, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that reminded Ryan of the evening when he'd first seen Caroline running through the rain. So much had changed since then, but the most important things, his love for his daughter, his commitment to doing what was right, his determination to protect the innocent, remained exactly the same. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new dangers, new decisions that would shape the rest of their lives. But tonight, they were safe, they were together, and Theodore Ashford was behind bars where he belonged. It was enough. For now, it was enough. The federal safe house on Harborview Drive looked deceptively ordinary from the outside, a modest 2-story colonial with blue shutters and a white picket fence that could have belonged to any middle-class family in Millbrook Harbor. But Ryan knew that the unremarkable exterior concealed surveillance equipment sophisticated enough to detect a mosquito landing on the front porch, and that the pleasant-looking neighbors on either side were actually deputy U.S. Marshals, whose flower gardens hid motion sensors, and whose morning jogs were carefully choreographed patrol routes. 3 weeks had passed since Theodore Ashford's arrest, and the investigation had expanded far beyond what anyone had initially imagined. Agent Wells visited daily with updates that painted an increasingly disturbing picture of corruption that reached from small-town harbor masters to congressional aides in Washington. The financial records from Ashford's vault had unlocked a web of bribes, extortion, and systematic criminal activity that spanned decades and involved hundreds of people across multiple states. The good news, Agent Wells said during her morning briefing, settling into the kitchen chair that had become her usual spot, is that we've made 17 additional arrests in the past week. Ashford's network is collapsing faster than they can coordinate their defense strategies. Caroline looked up from where she was helping Lily with her homework at the kitchen table, a domestic scene that still struck Ryan as surreal given everything they'd been through. What about Jeremy Blackstone? Have you found him yet? Still in the wind, Agent Wells admitted. He disappeared from his Boston apartment the night after your grandfather's arrest. We have reason to believe he's fled the country, possibly to the Cayman Islands where the Blackstone family maintains offshore accounts. Ryan felt a chill of unease. Jeremy Blackstone represented unfinished business, a loose thread that could unravel everything they'd accomplished. As long as he remained free, Caroline would never be truly safe from the marriage arrangement that had been designed to give Theodore Ashford access to her inheritance. What happens if he comes back? Ryan asked. Legally, I mean, could he still try to claim some kind of engagement contract? Not likely, Agent Wells replied. We've frozen all of Ashford's assets, including any contracts or agreements involving Miss Ashford's trust fund. Plus, we have documentary evidence that the proposed marriage was part of a criminal conspiracy. No legitimate court would enforce an engagement that was arranged for the purpose of facilitating murder. Lily finished her math worksheet and looked up at the adults with the expression of someone who had been patiently waiting for a break in the conversation. Agent Wells, do you have kids? I do, Agent Wells said, her professional demeanor softening. 2 daughters, about your age. Do they know about the bad guys you catch? They know I have an important job helping people stay safe, Agent Wells replied carefully. Just like they know your daddy helped catch some very bad people who were hurting innocent families. Are we still in danger? Lily asked with the direct honesty that children brought to questions adults preferred to avoid. Agent Wells exchanged a glance with Ryan before answering. There are still some bad people who might want to cause trouble, which is why we have marshals watching over you. But every day we catch more of them, and every day you become a little bit safer. It was a diplomatic answer, but Ryan knew the reality was more complicated. Theodore Ashford's criminal organization had been built over decades. with roots that reached into legitimate businesses, government agencies, and financial institutions. Dismantling it completely would take years, and there would always be former associates who might seek revenge against the witnesses who had brought down their operation. The phone rang, and Caroline answered it with the careful caution that had become second nature since entering federal protection. "Hello?" Ryan watched her face change from neutral wariness to something approaching joy. "Mrs. Patterson?" "Yes, I'm fine." "No, we can't have visitors yet. But Agent Wells says maybe in a few more weeks. Tell everyone at the school that Lily misses them too." It was a reminder of how much their lives had been constrained by the protection protocols. Lily was being homeschooled by a federal tutor rather than attending Millbrook Elementary. Their grocery shopping was done by marshals, and they hadn't been allowed any contact with friends or neighbors beyond brief, monitored phone calls. "Actually," Agent Wells said after Caroline hung up, "there's something I wanted to discuss with all of you. We've reached a point in the investigation where we might be able to ease some of the restrictions on your movements and interactions." Ryan felt a spark of hope. "What does that mean?" "It means we're confident enough in our security arrangements to allow supervised visits from approved individuals. It means Lily might be able to return to school with marshal escorts. It means you could potentially resume some kind of normal work routine, again with appropriate security measures." "What's changed?" Caroline asked. "We've neutralized most of the immediate threats," Agent Wells explained. "The people who might have been hired to eliminate witnesses are either in custody or have fled the country. Ashford's financial resources have been frozen, so he can't pay for new assassination attempts. And frankly, the media attention this case has generated makes it almost impossible for anyone to move against you without drawing unwanted scrutiny." The media attention had indeed been intense. The story of a single father and an heiress exposing a multi-generational murder conspiracy had captured national imagination, turning Ryan and Caroline into reluctant celebrities whose faces appeared regularly on cable news programs and magazine covers. It was uncomfortable and invasive, but Agent Wells was right that it provided a certain level of protection. It would be very difficult to make them disappear quietly when half the country was following their story. "There is one condition," Agent Wells continued. "We're going to need you to testify in federal court when Ashford's trial begins next month. Full testimony, open court, everything on the record." Caroline paled slightly. "Facing grandfather in court, describing what he did to Diana and Margaret, it's going to be difficult." "I'll be right there," Ryan said firmly. "And so will Agent Wells and the prosecution team. You won't be alone." "More importantly," Agent Wells added, "your testimony is going to ensure that Theodore Ashford spends the rest of his life in federal prison, along with everyone who helped him commit his crimes. Caroline, you have the power to make sure that no other young woman ever suffers what you and your cousins went through." That afternoon, after Agent Wells had left and Lily was napping on the living room couch, Ryan and Caroline found themselves sitting on the back porch of the safe house, watching the sun reflect off Millbrook Harbor in the distance. It was the first moment of genuine peace they'd had since everything began, and Ryan was struck by how different Caroline looked now compared to the terrified woman in the wedding dress he'd first encountered. "Do you ever regret it?" Caroline asked quietly. "Getting involved, I mean. Your life was difficult before, but it was yours. Now you're stuck in federal protection indefinitely, your daughter can't have a normal childhood, and you're probably never going to be completely safe." Ryan was quiet for a moment, thinking about Emma and the promise he'd made to always do the right thing regardless of the personal cost. "Caroline, 3 weeks ago my biggest worry was whether I could afford Lily's school supplies and keep the heat turned on through the winter. Now I wake up every morning knowing that we helped stop a serial killer who had been murdering young women for decades. We saved lives. Not just yours, but all the future victims who would have died if Ashford's organization had continued operating. But at what cost? Your privacy, your freedom, your ability to live a normal life?" "What's normal?" Ryan asked. "Working 2 jobs just to keep my head above water while rich criminals operate with impunity? Having to explain to my 7-year-old daughter why some people get away with hurting others just because they have money and influence? Caroline, we didn't just save your life. We proved that ordinary people can stand up to corruption and win." Caroline was crying now, tears streaming down her face as years of suppressed emotion finally found release. "I keep thinking about Diana and Margaret. about how different their lives might have been if someone had been brave enough to help them the way you helped me. They died alone, believing that no one cared enough to save them. Ryan reached over and took her hand, feeling the calluses that had developed over the past 3 weeks from helping with household chores and yard work, the first manual labor Caroline had ever done in her privileged but imprisoned life. They didn't die for nothing, Ryan said firmly, because what happened to them is part of what's going to put Theodore Ashford away forever. Their murders are going to be the evidence that ensures he never hurts anyone else. Do you think? Caroline hesitated, then forced herself to continue. Do you think we can really build normal lives after this? I've never had to think about things like getting a job, paying bills, making friends who aren't connected to grandfather's social circle. I don't know how to be a regular person. Ryan smiled, thinking about all the challenges they still faced and all the ways their lives would never be completely ordinary. Caroline, I don't think either of us is ever going to be completely regular. But maybe that's not such a bad thing. Maybe the world needs more people who are willing to be irregular when regular isn't good enough. From inside the house came the sound of Lily waking up from her nap, calling for her daddy, with the sleepy contentment of a child who felt safe and loved despite all the chaos swirling around the adult world. Besides, Ryan added, standing up to go check on his daughter, we've got plenty of time to figure out what normal looks like for us. Right now we just need to focus on getting through the trial and making sure justice is served. As they walked back into the house together, Ryan realized that somewhere along the way, their temporary alliance had become something deeper and more permanent. They were family now, not by blood or marriage, but by choice and shared experience and mutual commitment to protecting each other and the values they believed in. The trial would be difficult, the media attention would continue to be intrusive, and there would always be some level of danger from Theodore Ashford's former associates. But they would face it all together, with federal protection and community support and the unshakable knowledge that they had done something important and necessary and right. The war for justice was far from over, but they had already won the most important battle, the one for their own souls and their ability to sleep peacefully at night, knowing they had stood up when it mattered most. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight they were safe, they were together, and Theodore Ashford was behind bars where he belonged. For now, that was enough to build a future upon. The federal courthouse in Boston was a fortress of marble and steel, its imposing columns and armed security creating an atmosphere of gravity that seemed to press down on everyone who entered. Ryan adjusted his tie for the 3rd time as he walked through the metal detectors, Caroline beside him wearing a simple navy dress that made her look younger and more vulnerable than the confident woman she had become over the past 2 months. "You ready for this?" he asked quietly as they made their way to the courtroom where Theodore Ashford would finally face justice for his crimes. "As ready as I'll ever be," Caroline replied, though her voice carried the tension of someone about to confront the monster who had controlled her entire life. "Agent Wells says the prosecution has enough evidence to convict him 10 times over, but I still need to look him in the eye and tell the truth about what he did." The courtroom was packed with reporters, federal agents, and family members of Theodore Ashford's victims. Not just Diana and Margaret, but the dozens of people who had been murdered or disappeared over the decades to protect his criminal empire. Ryan recognized some faces from Millbrook Harbor, including Chief Morrison, who had testified earlier about the systematic corruption that had allowed Ashford's crimes to continue unchecked. Theodore Ashford sat at the defendant's table in an expensive suit that couldn't disguise the fact that he was now just another criminal facing judgment. His silver hair was perfectly styled, his posture erect and dignified, but Ryan could see the desperation in his eyes, the look of a man who had controlled everything for so long that the concept of consequences was foreign and terrifying. The prosecution calls Caroline Elizabeth Ashford to the stand. Caroline squeezed Ryan's hand once, then walked toward the witness stand with her head held high. As she was sworn in, Ryan thought about the terrified woman in a wedding dress he had first encountered in that parking lot, and marveled at the transformation that courage and truth could create in a person. "Miss Ashford," the federal prosecutor began, "please tell the court about your relationship to the defendant." "Theodore Ashford is my grandfather," Caroline said, her voice clear and steady. "He has controlled every aspect of my life since I was 3 years old, when my parents signed over their parental rights to him in exchange for money." The prosecutor guided Caroline through her testimony with practiced skill, establishing the pattern of control and manipulation that had defined her childhood and young adulthood. She described the arranged marriage to Jeremy Blackstone, the discovery of her cousin's murders, and the confession letter that had exposed the full scope of Theodore Ashford's crimes. "Miss Ashford," the prosecutor continued, "I'm going to play a recording for the court. Can you identify the voice on this recording?" The courtroom fell silent as Theodore Ashford's own words filled the space, describing Diana's murder in clinical detail. Ryan watched the faces of the jurors as they heard a grandfather casually explaining how he had poisoned his own granddaughter, and he saw the moment when disbelief turned to horror and then to determination that justice must be served. "That is my grandfather's voice," Carolyn confirmed when the recording ended. "Those are his words, describing how he murdered my cousin Diana for her inheritance money, just as he murdered Margaret and was planning to murder me." Theodore Ashford's defense attorney tried to discredit the recording, suggesting it had been obtained illegally or manipulated digitally, but the FBI's technical experts had already testified about the recording's authenticity. The evidence was overwhelming, undeniable, and damning. When it came time for cross-examination, Ashford's lawyer attempted to portray Caroline as an unstable young woman who had been manipulated by Ryan into fabricating evidence against her loving grandfather. But Caroline had spent 2 months preparing for this moment, working with federal prosecutors to anticipate every possible attack on her credibility. "Sir," Caroline said calmly when the defense attorney suggested she was lying about the arranged marriage, "I have bank records showing the payments my grandfather made to Jeremy Blackstone's family. I have contracts outlining the terms of the marriage arrangement. I have medical records from Jeremy's previous fiancées documenting their injuries. Would you like me to describe in detail what my grandfather planned to have done to me after the wedding?" The defense attorney quickly moved on to other topics, but Ryan could see that Caroline's composure and detailed knowledge had impressed the jury. She wasn't the confused victim they might have expected. She was a survivor who had gathered evidence and fought back against impossible odds. When Caroline finished her testimony and returned to her seat beside Ryan, he could see the exhaustion in her eyes, but also something else: relief. She had finally told the truth about Theodore Ashford in a forum where it mattered, where it would be recorded permanently and used to ensure that justice was served. The trial continued for 3 more days, with federal agents testifying about the scope of Ashford's criminal organization, financial experts explaining the money laundering schemes that had funded his operations, and former associates who had agreed to cooperate in exchange for reduced sentences describing the systematic corruption that had protected him for decades. But Ryan knew that Caroline's testimony had been the crucial moment, the personal, human story that gave meaning to all the financial records and legal documents. She had looked directly at her grandfather and described what he had done, not just to her, but to every member of their family who had been sacrificed for his greed and ambition. The jury deliberated for 6 hours before returning with their verdict. "On the charge of conspiracy to commit murder in the first degree, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of murder in the first degree in the death of Diana Elizabeth Ashford, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of murder in the first degree in the death of Margaret Rose Ashford, we find the defendant guilty." The list continued: 47 separate charges, 47 guilty verdicts that would ensure Theodore Ashford spent the rest of his life in federal prison without the possibility of parole. Ryan watched the old man's face as each verdict was read, seeing the moment when the reality of his situation finally penetrated his arrogance and denial. After the sentencing hearing, where Theodore Ashford received multiple life sentences plus 400 years in prison, Ryan and Caroline stood on the courthouse steps facing a crowd of reporters and cameras. Agent Wells had prepared them for this moment, coaching them on how to speak publicly about their experience without compromising ongoing investigations into Ashford's associates. "Mr. Torres," called out a reporter from CNN, "what would you say to other people who might witness crimes but are afraid to get involved?" Ryan looked out at the crowd, thinking about Pete Henderson and Chief Morrison and all the ordinary people in Millbrook Harbor who had chosen to stand up when it mattered most. "I'd say that evil only wins when good people choose to look the other way," Ryan replied. "Caroline and I didn't set out to be heroes. We just saw something wrong and decided we couldn't live with ourselves if we didn't try to stop it. Sometimes that's all it takes to change everything." "Miss Ashford," another reporter asked, "what are your plans now that the trial is over?" Caroline looked at Ryan and Lily, who had been sitting in the courtroom's gallery throughout the proceedings, then back at the cameras that were broadcasting their story around the world. "I'm going to learn how to live a normal life," she said simply. "I'm going to get a job, make friends who care about me rather than my trust fund, and figure out who I really am when I'm not defined by someone else's expectations. And I'm going to make sure that the foundation we're establishing in Diana's and Margaret's names prevents other families from suffering the way ours did. 6 months later, Ryan stood in the backyard of the house they had purchased together on Seabird Street, not the cramped apartment where he and Lily had struggled to survive, but a real home with enough space for all of them to grow and heal. Caroline was inside helping Lily with her homework, their voices carrying through the open kitchen window as they worked on a science project about ocean currents. The federal protection had ended 3 months earlier, after the last of Theodore Ashford's major associates had been arrested or fled the country. Jeremy Blackstone remained at large, believed to be hiding in a non-extradition country. But he was no longer considered an active threat. The Ashford criminal empire had been completely dismantled, its assets seized and distributed to victims' families and law enforcement agencies. Ryan had returned to work at Henderson Hardware, but now as a partner rather than an employee. Pete Henderson had offered him a stake in the business after the publicity from the trial had brought new customers and opportunities to the small store. Caroline had used a portion of her inheritance, now legally hers, after the court had invalidated all of Theodore Ashford's fraudulent arrangements, to help expand the business and create jobs for other people in Millbrook Harbor who needed second chances. The media attention had gradually faded, replaced by newer stories and different heroes, but the impact of their actions continued to ripple outward. Congressional hearings had been launched into federal oversight of trust funds and inheritance law. New whistleblower protection programs had been established. Most importantly, other victims of family abuse and financial manipulation had found the courage to come forward, knowing that justice was possible even against the most powerful perpetrators. "Daddy," Lily called from the back door, "Caroline says dinner's ready, and she made your favorite pasta." Ryan smiled, remembering Emma's prediction that he would always help people who needed it, regardless of the personal cost. She had been right, but she probably never could have imagined that helping a stranger in a parking lot would lead to this: a new family, a renewed sense of purpose, and the knowledge that sometimes ordinary people really could change the world. As he walked toward the house where the two most important people in his life were waiting for him, Ryan reflected on how much had changed since that stormy October night when he had chosen to step between Caroline and her pursuers. He had lost his anonymity, his simple life, his ability to blend into the background and avoid complications. But he had gained something far more valuable, the certainty that when faced with a choice between safety and justice, he would always choose justice. And he had gained a family that was bound together not by blood or obligation, but by shared courage and mutual love, and the unshakable knowledge that they had stood up when it mattered most. Theodore Ashford would spend the rest of his life in prison, his empire destroyed, and his legacy reduced to a cautionary tale about the corruption that absolute power creates. Jeremy Blackstone would live the rest of his life in exile, always looking over his shoulder for the federal agents who would never stop hunting him. But Ryan Torres, Caroline Ashford, and Lily Torres would live the rest of their lives as free people in a community that was safer because they had refused to look away when evil revealed itself. They had won not just justice for the victims of Theodore Ashford's crimes, but something more precious: the right to sleep peacefully knowing they had done everything possible to protect the innocent and hold the guilty accountable. The war between good and evil would continue long after their story ended, but they had fought their battle and won their victory. In a world that often seemed dominated by corruption and cruelty, they had proven that sometimes, just sometimes, the good guys really do win. And that was enough to build a lifetime of hope upon. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.